Before dawn, on the 25th of April, 1644, a man of 33 walked into a courtyard in Beijing and rang a bell. That bell had one job. It summoned every minister and general in the Chinese Empire to emergency audience, and it had never needed to be rung twice, because the man pulling the rope was the Son of Heaven. He rang it again. The courtyard stayed empty. Out past the palace walls, the northern sky had gone, the color of smoke, and the men who ran the empire had already worked out which way this was going. So the last emperor of the Ming turned around, walked out through a back gate of the largest palace on earth, the one his own family had built, and started up the hill behind it, with one servant beside him. We will come back to that hill, and to what he wrote before he reached the tree at the top, because the road to it starts 300 years earlier, 700 miles south, with a boy standing over 3 bodies. Summer, 1344, his father, his mother, and his oldest brother, dead inside a month, of hunger, and of what came after hunger. The family owned no land. They did not own enough ground to dig 3 graves. So the boy went to a neighbor and begged for a patch of dirt to bury his parents in, and a man named Liu gave him one. The dynasty that built the Forbidden City did not start in a palace. It started with a boy begging for a grave. 24 years later, that boy crowned himself Emperor of China. What he took over was a wreck. What his family did with it rebuilt the country from the soil up, and most of it is still standing. So, how did an empire strong enough to remake China fail to save itself? His name was Zhu Chongba, and the name tells you everything about the family he was born into. Zhu was the surname. Chongba was barely a name at all. Poor families in 14th century China often numbered their children instead of naming them, working off birth order and the birthdays of relatives, and nobody expected the number to be replaced by anything grander. His father had been called Zhu Wuxi. His grandfather had been called Zhu Chuyi. 4 and 1. That was the family's whole tradition of naming, running back generations, and it meant these people had never once needed a name that anybody outside the village would have to remember. He was born in 1328 in a village near the Huai River, the youngest of 6 or 7 children, in a tenant farming family that moved every few years, hunting for a landlord with better terms. There were no better terms. His father worked ground he did not own. His grandfather had worked ground he did not own. The horizon stopped there. Then came 1344, and the drought, and the locusts that came in behind the drought, and the sickness that came in behind the locusts. His father died. His oldest brother died. His mother died. It took less than a month. He was 16, and there was one surviving brother, and between the 2 of them, they had no plot of ground to put 3 bodies in. They went to the landlord and asked. He turned them down. They went to a neighbor named Liu Jizu, and Liu gave them a strip of hillside. And the brothers wrapped the bodies in whatever cloth was in the house, and carried them up and buried them without coffins and without a rite. Decades later, when he had every reason to invent a better childhood, he wrote that scene down himself. The bodies, the refusal, the borrowed dirt. He had it carved into a stone tablet at his parents' tomb, and the tablet is still there, and there is nothing in the imperial literature of China quite like it. Now, while he is standing on that hillside, look at the country around him, because the reason his family died is not weather. somewhere in a county office in the same region that spring, a clerk was doing the paperwork on households like his. Names, adults, land worked, grain owed, and in the column where a household had died out or run off, the clerk did what the system required, which was to keep the total owed by the district the same and let the surviving households absorb the difference. That is the sentence this whole story runs on. In the Chinese tax system of the period, a household that vanished did not cancel its debt. The debt slid sideways onto whoever was still breathing. So the survivors of a famine inherited the tax bills of the dead. And the more people died, the heavier the bill got for the ones left standing. Hold on to that. Because 300 years from now, on the last page of this story, a clerk in a different province is going to do the exact same arithmetic and bring the whole thing down. The government doing the collecting was the Yuan, and the Yuan were Mongols. Kublai Khan had finished the conquest of China by 1279, the first foreigner in history to hold all of it. And for a good long while it worked. The roads were safe. Merchants crossed from the Mediterranean to the Pacific under one system of protection. Marco Polo came east and went home with stories Venice refused to believe. Grain moved north up the canals. Silver moved south. And a farmer on the Huai could live his whole life without thinking hard about who sat on the throne in the north. Then the top of the machine broke. In the space of about 5 years, from 1328 to 1333, the throne changed hands 6 times, and one emperor managed to reign, lose the throne, and take it back again. Every one of those changes was settled by knives among the princes and the great households, and every winner arrived with a crowd of supporters who had to be paid. The men at the top were too busy killing each other for the throne to look at what was happening underneath it. Underneath it, the money was dissolving. The yuan ran on paper currency, one of the boldest financial experiments of the medieval world, and for decades it held. Then the government started printing to cover its deficits, the way governments do, and the notes slid, and merchants started refusing them. By the 1340s, a farmer selling grain for paper was taking something that might be worth half as much by the time he walked home. Salt was a state monopoly and a state revenue stream, and it priced itself past the reach of the people who needed it, which turned salt smuggling into a whole underground economy with its own armed gangs. Some of those gangs are going to matter later. Then the river came out. The Yellow River carries a monstrous load of silt, and over the centuries the silt raises its own bed until the water is running above the level of the fields on either side, held in place by dikes that have to be maintained forever. In the 1340s, the maintenance failed. In 1344, the dikes broke on a catastrophic scale, and the river went out across the North China Plain and drowned an enormous stretch of the most densely farmed land on Earth, and wrecked long sections of the Grand Canal that carried the capital's rice. That was the same year the boy was burying his parents, 700 miles from the breach. In a province the flood never touched. He did not need the flood. Drought and locusts and disease had already done the work, and the district was still being assessed on a register that assumed everyone was alive. There is one more thing worth knowing about that decade, and it makes the whole century look different. The 14th century was a catastrophe for human beings across the entire Eurasian landmass. The same years that emptied villages in Henan were emptying villages in Tuscany. In Europe they named it and remembered it forever. In China the record is more scattered, county by county, epidemic after epidemic. and historians still argue about exactly what the killers were. What is not in doubt is the scale, or the fact that neither end of the continent had the faintest idea what was happening at the other. So in 1344, the emperor was 2,000 miles away. The money was garbage. The river was loose. And the tax collector was still coming. That combination has a way of making people religious. The White Lotus was an old strand of popular Buddhism, unlicensed, distrusted by the authorities, and enormously appealing to people whose lives had stopped making any sense. Its preachers taught that the Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, was on his way, and that his arrival would come after catastrophe, fire, flood, plague, the collapse of a rotten order, and then a new age of light. Anybody standing in the mud in 1344 could check the boxes. The government banned the sects, which did what bans do. The preaching went underground and kept traveling. Then, in 1351, the court made the decision that finished it. The Grand Canal had to be repaired, because the capital in the north ate rice grown in the south, and the canal was how the rice got there. So the government ordered the Yellow River forced back into a controlled channel. And to do the work, they conscripted something like 150,000 laborers and marched them to the site under military supervision. Look at what the court had just built. 150,000 men, pulled from exactly the districts that had been flooded and starved and squeezed hardest, packed into camps, fed badly, worked hard, with long evenings and nothing to do but talk to each other. Every underground preacher in central China walked straight into those camps. There is a story about what happened next, and it is too good to skip and too convenient to swallow whole. The men digging the new channel are supposed to have turned up a stone statue, a man with a single eye, and carved on its back was a line that had already been circulating in the villages for months. Do not stir the one-eyed stone man. Steer him, and the empire rises in revolt. Somebody buried that statue. Nobody has ever known who, and the sensible reading is that the organizers put it there themselves and seeded the prophecy first, so the discovery would look like heaven talking. It worked either way. The story ran through the camps and out into the countryside, and in the summer of 1351, the red turbans rose. They took the name from the cloth they tied around their heads. Within a year, they were not a rebellion so much as a climate. Bands rose in Henan, in Anhui, in Hubei, up and down the Yangtze Valley. Some religious, some opportunistic, some of them just armed men eating their way across a district. Yuan armies won battles and could not win the war, put down a rising in one prefecture and two more opened behind it. By the middle of the 1350s, entire provinces had stopped answering the capital. Warlords carved out territories and called themselves kings. The Mongol court went on with its factional politics as though the country outside the walls were a rumor somebody had started. And out in that wreckage, a young man with a shaved head was walking from village to village with a wooden bowl, learning the shape of a country that no longer had a government. The gate of the Huangjue Monastery, outside Fengyang. In the autumn of 1344, a 16-year-old turned up at it with nothing, and they let him in. Nobody involved mistook this for a religious calling. His parents had promised him to the temple years earlier during a childhood illness, which gave the abbot a reason to accept him. And the reason he went is simpler than that. The monastery had grain. He did not. He shaved his head, put on the robe, and became the lowest thing in the building. The novice who swept, hauled water, lit lamps, and got hit when the senior monks were in a mood. He described those weeks later without any softening. He had traded starving in a village for being humiliated in a temple, and he took the trade. It lasted about 50 days. The temple lived on rent from its land and on donations from farmers. And by that winter, the farmers had nothing to give, and the tenants had nothing to pay. The granary emptied. The abbot ran the only arithmetic available and dissolved the community, handed each monk a bowl, and sent him out to beg. The building stayed. The monks scattered. So at 16, with a bowl and a robe and no particular destination, he started walking. He walked for 3 years. That fact matters more than anything else that happened to him before he ever held a weapon. He went west and south through Anhui, into Henan, out along the districts of the Huai and beyond, hundreds of miles on foot, sleeping in ruined temples and roadside shrines, eating what people handed him and going without when they did not. Some days he begged in market towns that still had markets. Some days he crossed country where the villages stood empty and there was nobody left to beg from. Nobody teaches a peasant boy the shape of an empire. He learned it with his feet. He learned which prefectures still had officials at their desks and which had been quietly given up on. He learned where the yuan garrisons actually sat, as opposed to where the maps put them. He learned which roads the salt smugglers used, which river crossings could be taken, which local strongmen had built their own walls and were collecting their own taxes and had stopped pretending otherwise. He learned the dialects. He learned how much rice a man needs to walk 20 miles. And he learned what it feels like to arrive somewhere as a person of no consequence and be looked straight through, which is a thing he never once forgot. Years later, giving instructions to his officials about how to handle the rural poor, he wrote, with a specificity no emperor in Chinese history had ever managed, for the plain reason that no emperor in Chinese history had done what he had done. He knew what the tax collector looks like from below. In 1348 he went back to the monastery, which had partly reopened, and there he did the thing that changed everything downstream. He learned to read. He was 20. He had no schooling of any kind, and written Chinese is not forgiving to late starters. He went at it anyway, in a Templar, without a proper tutor, and he never entirely lost the roughness. His writing as emperor stayed blunt, direct, occasionally crude by the standards of the scholars who had to read it, and completely clear. He also picked up a permanent suspicion of men who wrote beautifully, and that suspicion is going to cost a great many people their lives. For 4 more years he stayed in the temple while the country outside came apart. Then, in the spring of 1352, a letter arrived for him. It came from a childhood friend named Tang He, who had joined a red turban band under a commander called Guo Zixing, and it said what those letters say. Come, there is a place for you here. In the wrong hands that letter was a death sentence. Yuan forces in the region were sweeping for rebel sympathizers, and a man caught holding an invitation from a red turban officer was finished on the spot. Then another monk let him know the letter had been noticed and that somebody was thinking about reporting it. So he had 3 ways to die and a few days to pick one. Stay in the temple and get taken by the government, run, and get taken as a vagrant, or go join a rebellion that the imperial army was currently grinding into powder across 3 provinces. He did what people of his time and place did with an impossible choice. He went to the shrine, took up the divination blocks, and asked, Staying came back inauspicious. Fleeing came back inauspicious. He asked about joining the rebellion, and the blocks came up favorable. Believe what you like about the blocks. He believed them. He walked out of the monastery in the spring of 1352, went to the rebel camp at Haozhou, and enlisted as a private soldier at 24. He was, by every surviving description, a startling-looking man, tall for the region, heavy-boned, with a jaw that jutted and a pitted face, and a physical presence that unsettled people before he opened his mouth. Court painters later produced two completely different traditions of portrait for him, one flattering and imperial, one so grotesque it reads a caricature, and historians have argued for centuries over which lie sits closer to the truth. What nobody disputes is that men noticed him in a crowd. Guo Zixing noticed him inside a month. The rebel commander was a former local landowner running an armed camp on his own account. And he needed one thing more than he needed soldiers. He needed subordinates who could think. The new recruit could read, which almost nobody in the ranks could. He went first in a fight and came back, which is the kind of courage men remember. And he had a habit that showed up early and stayed for 50 years. He handed out plunder instead of pocketing it, and soldiers noticed that immediately and permanently. Within weeks he was a squad leader. Within months he was one of Guo's personal officers. And Guo did what commanders in that world did with a promising young man. He made him family. The histories call her Lady Ma. She was Guo Zixing's adopted daughter, orphaned young, and by the custom of the time and the camp, she was handed to a rising officer the way a horse or a commission might be handed over. She was in her early 20s. She could read, which for a woman of her background was unusual, and she had grown up inside a military household watching men calculate. She turned out to be the single most consequential person in his life. The stories about her carry the polish that gets applied to founding empresses, and some of them are surely too neat. There is a famous one from these early years. When Guo Zixing turned on his young officer in a fit of suspicion and had him locked up without food, and Lady Ma is supposed to have carried fresh-baked cakes to him hidden inside her clothing, burning herself badly, and said nothing about the burns. Set the cakes aside. The part that runs through 4 decades of documentation is harder and more interesting. She argued with him. She kept arguing with him after he was emperor, after he had become a man that grown officials approached on their knees, after disagreeing with him had become a reliable way to die. She interceded for condemned men, and sometimes she got them off. She reminded him, in front of witnesses, where he came from. There is a well-attested episode where he intended to execute a scholar over a phrase in a document, and she refused to eat until he relented. He listened to her, and to almost nobody else, for 30 years. Remember that. In 1382, she is going to die. And, after that, the last break on the man comes off. But that is decades out. In 1352, he was a junior officer in a shaky rebel camp, in a province full of other rebel camps, taking orders from a warlord who was already jealous of him. In a country where 100 men just like him were rising and getting killed every season. What separated him from those 100 men had nothing to do with fighting. Anybody could fight. He had spent 3 years walking through the ruins of the Yuan state with a begging bowl, and he had come out the other side carrying a map in his head of a country that was falling apart. He knew where the grain was. He knew which walls were real. He knew what a starving village would do for a commander who fed it, and what it would do to a commander who looted it. Everyone else in that camp was trying to win a war. He had already started thinking about what came after one. In the spring of 1356, an army came in through the gates of Nanjing, and the first order the commander gave had nothing to do with the treasury or the arsenal. No looting, on pain of death, to every man in the column. That was not how a city capture worked in the middle of the 14th century. A town that fell to armed men got stripped. The soldiers understood the stripping as their wages, and a commander who interfered risked a mutiny in the streets. Zhu Yuanzhang, who had swapped Chongba for a proper adult name years earlier, the way a man changes clothes for a new job, hanged men over it. Then he sent for the local scholars. He was 28. 4 years earlier he had been a private soldier. What he did in Nanjing over the following decade is the reason there was a Ming Dynasty at all, and almost none of it was about courage. Start with how he got the city. Guo Zixing died in 1355. His son inherited the command, and then died too, in a battle, along with Guo's brother. Nobody had to arrange anything. The army looked around and found the only man left who could hold it together was the officer from the temple, and the officer from the temple took it, along with roughly 20,000 men, and a stretch of the Yangtze Valley worth almost nothing. The river was the point. North of it, the Yuan armies were still fighting and still winning battles, grinding themselves down against the bigger red turban forces up there. South of it lay the richest farmland in the world, the rice bowl of the empire, held by local warlords and defended by nobody who mattered. He crossed south. Nanjing sat on the river with old walls and good ground, and he took it in 1356 and made it his capital, and did not leave for 20 years. Then he stopped conquering, which is what separates him from every other warlord in this story. There is a piece of advice he got in those years that Chinese schoolchildren still learn. From a scholar named Zhu Sheng: build the walls high. Stockpile the grain. Wait before claiming the title of king. Every word of it was about restraint. Fortify what you hold instead of chasing more. Feed yourself instead of eating the countryside. Stay small enough that the Yuan court points its armies at somebody else. He followed all three. For years, while men with bigger territories and grander titles bled themselves out in the north, and he collected scholars. This is the part that surprises people who only know the ending. The illiterate peasant who taught himself to read in a monastery went out of his way, repeatedly, expensively, and with real patience, to recruit educated men into his administration. He sent invitation. He sent them again when they were refused. The most famous of them, a Zhejiang scholar named Lu Bowen, turned him down at first and had to be courted, and once he came, he functioned as the closest thing the operation had to a strategic mind. The reasoning was practical. An army can take a county. It cannot run one. Somebody has to assess the harvest, register the households, hear the lawsuits, repair the dikes, and keep the grain moving. And none of that gets done by a man whose only skill is a spear. Every other rebel commander in China was raising armies. He was raising an army and a civil service at the same time. And in the territory behind his lines, farmers found the taxes were lighter than under the Yuan, and the soldiers left their daughters alone. Word like that travels faster than news of victories. By the late 1350s, villages in contested country were sending word that they would open their gates for him and fight anybody else, which is a form of military power that never shows up in a troop count. Then he had to fight for it. By the early 1360s, the South had shaken out into three serious powers, and it was obvious two of them were going to have to die. Upriver. In the middle Yangtze sat Chen Yuliang. He was the most dangerous man in China, a former minor clerk who had climbed a rebel movement by murdering the leaders above him, one at a time, until there was nobody above him. He held a huge territory, the largest army in the country, and a river fleet built for the specific purpose of coming downstream and killing Zhu Yuanzhang. In 1360 he declared himself emperor of a dynasty he called the Han. Downriver, around Suzhou, sat Zhang Shicheng, a former salt smuggler, wealthy past counting, sitting on the most productive land in China and disinclined to risk any of it. He built walls, collected revenue, patronized poets, and waited. Zhu Yuanzhang was in the middle, weaker than Chen and richer only than the ground he was standing on. He picked his enemy on purpose, and the reasoning survives. Take Zhang first, he said, and Chen comes down the river onto our backs while we are busy. Take Chen first, and Zhang sits in Suzhou and does nothing, because Zhang always does nothing. He was exactly right about Zhang. Everything depended on being right about Chen. In the summer of 1363, Chen Yuliang came downstream to settle it. He brought a fleet that contemporaries described in numbers that strain belief, hundreds of warships, some of them 3 decks tall, painted red, with iron plating on the towers and horses stabled aboard. With them he brought his court, his family, and by the accounts of the day, an army in the hundreds of thousands. He was not raiding. He was moving his entire state downriver to end the war. He stopped to besiege Nanchang, held by Zhu Yuanzhang's nephew with a badly outnumbered garrison, and the nephew held for 85 days. That delay is the whole story. It bought time for Zhu Yuanzhang to come up the river with everything he had, which was a fleet perhaps a third the size, made of smaller and lower boats. They met on Lake Poyang, the largest freshwater lake in China, in the last days of August, and they fought there for 36 days. By the number of men involved, it is one of the largest naval battles in the history of the world, and almost nobody outside China has heard of it. The figures in the sources run to 500,000 combatants on the water. It happened 150 years before any European fleet action of that size. On a lake, in the interior of a continent, between two men who had both been born peasants. The first days went badly. Chen's ships were taller, and height wins a boarding action the way it wins everything else on water. His crews chained the big vessels together in ranks to make floating fortresses, and the smaller boats coming at them broke and burned. On one of those days, Zhu Yuanzhang's flagship ran aground in the shallows, and Chen's ships closed on it. And for a stretch of that afternoon, the future of China depended on whether a stuck boat could be shoved off a sandbar under fire. He got off because a subordinate hauled him onto another vessel, and because the men left aboard kept fighting after he was gone. And, by several accounts, the officer who took his place there died in his clothes as a decoy. Then the wind changed. He did what commanders had been doing on Chinese water for 1,000 years, and what those chains had turned into suicide. He loaded small boats with reeds and powder, put volunteer crews aboard, and sent them downwind into the massed fleet. The fire went through the chains. Chen Yuliang lost hundreds of ships in an afternoon, and an enormous number of men, and every account of it says the lake burned. He tried to break out and run back upriver. In the fighting at the mouth, a stray arrow came through a gap and went into his eye and through his skull, and the war ended right there. On a boat, with an arrow that had nobody's name on it. His son surrendered the territory within months. Zhu Yuanzhang had just doubled the size of his state. Zhang Shicheng, who had sat in Suzhou through all 36 days and done nothing whatsoever, got his turn in 1366. The siege of his capital ran 10 months and ended with the city starving and the walls breached. And Zhang was taken to Nanjing, where he refused food, refused to speak, and eventually killed himself. His people, it should be said, had liked him. Suzhou remembered him fondly for generations, in a way it never remembered the man who took the city. That left the north, and the north was the Yuan. The campaign began in the autumn of 1367 under Shu Da, the best general of the age and a friend of Zhu Yuanzhang since they were boys in the same district. It went faster than anybody expected. Part of that was competence. Most of it was that the Mongol court had already lost. Its own commanders in the north had spent a decade fighting each other for position while the rebellions ran unchecked. And there was no longer a unified Yuan military to defeat. Only rivals who could be picked off one at a time. In the autumn of 1368, the Ming army reached Dadu, and the last Yuan emperor did not defend it. He rode out the northern gate with his court and his household and went back to the steppe. That distinction matters, and this story is going to need it twice. The Yuan were not destroyed in 1368. They were evicted from China. The court re-established itself in Mongolia and went on calling itself the rightful dynasty of China for generations, with its own emperors and its own succession. And Chinese historians call that continuation the Northern Yuan. Mongol armies stayed a genuine military threat for the entire length of the Ming. In 81 years, one of them is going to capture a Ming emperor alive. But from Nanjing, in the autumn of 1368, it looked like victory. 16 years. From a private soldier in a rebel camp to master of China, through the largest naval battle on earth and a 10-month siege and a northern campaign, at the age of 40, and what he had actually acquired was a country with its irrigation destroyed, its canals broken, its northern plain emptied, its cities burned, its currency worthless, and its records mostly gone. He had taken China, now he had to make it work again, and that was the harder war. On the 23rd of January, 1368, at the altar on the southern edge of Nanjing, a man who had spent 3 years walking the roads of central China with a begging bowl put on the yellow robe and told heaven he had received the mandate. The ceremony was ancient and the choreography was fixed. Announcements to heaven and earth, sacrifice, formal notification to the ancestors, which in this case meant 2 people buried without coffins on a hillside in Anhui by a teenager who had begged for the dirt. He took the reign name Hongwu, vast military accomplishment, which fit and also missed the point of everything that came after. He named the dynasty Ming, meaning bright, a word that came straight out of the religious movement that had produced the rebellion, the light that ends the age of darkness. Nobody in that square would have called what he inherited bright. Here is what the Ming actually took possession of: the North China Plain, the historic demographic heart of the country, had taken flood, famine, epidemic, and 20 years of war in sequence, and large districts of it had no people in them. Not fewer people. Known. Officials sent to re-establish local government in parts of Hainan, and Hebei reported walking through counties and finding villages standing empty with the fields gone to scrub. And the standing instruction in those cases was to hold the county on paper and wait for somebody to move in. Cultivated land, set against the figures of a century earlier, had collapsed. Millions of acres had gone out of production. Some drowned. Some abandoned by people who left or died. And abandoned farmland does not politely wait to be reclaimed. It reverts. Irrigation channels silt up in a season. Dikes fail in a few years. And once the water system of a district goes, the district goes with it. The Grand Canal, the artery that carried southern rice to the northern cities, was broken in multiple places and had been for decades. The currency was gone, not devalued, gone, in the sense that people had quit accepting paper and gone back to trading grain and cloth, which is what an economy does when it has given up on money. And the records were gone, which in the long run was the worst of it. The registers that told a government who lived where, what they owned, and what they owed had been burned, lost, falsified, or simply abandoned across whole provinces. A state that cannot see its own population, cannot tax it, cannot conscript from it, and cannot feed it in a famine. In 1368, the new emperor of China had roughly the same information about the interior of his own country that a foreign traveller would have had. He was 40 years old. He had won the largest war in the world, and he was starting a government from nothing. There is a detail about him from these years that people find hard to square with what came later. He never hid where he came from. Chinese founders acquired a genealogy on the way up. Court scholars would locate a distinguished ancestor, ideally a famous one, and the paperwork would quietly appear. It was expected. His advisors proposed exactly that and had a candidate ready. A celebrated Song Dynasty scholar who shared the family name and would have made a respectable forefather for an emperor. He turned it down. He said he was the son of a farmer. Then he went further than any founder of any dynasty in Chinese history. He wrote the account of his own childhood himself. The famine, the deaths, the landlord's refusal, the borrowed hillside, the begging bowl, the 3 years on the road. He had it carved onto a stone tablet and set up at his parents' tomb near Fengyang. In plain, hard language, with none of the elevation a court writer would have supplied. He built a temple to his parents and raised their grave into an imperial mausoleum. And he kept telling his officials, in memorial after memorial, for 30 years, that he had been hungry and they had not, and that they should keep it in mind when they were deciding how hard to squeeze a village. He also, over those same 30 years, turned into one of the most frightening rulers who ever held the office. And men learned that mentioning his origins in the wrong tone could end a career and occasionally a life. Both of those things were true at once, and neither cancels the other. What he did with the country in the first years shows the mind more clearly than any of it. He put the capital at Nanjing, in the south, near the productive heartland, and began building it into the largest walled city on earth. The Nanjing Wall ran more than 20 miles. Following the terrain, instead of the neat rectangle Chinese capitals traditionally used, and long stretches of it are still standing. Every brick in it was stamped. The stamp gave the county that produced it. The kiln, the supervising official, and the individual brickmaker. If a section failed, the state could find the man responsible decades later. Hold on to that. It shows up again in Beijing, and it tells you how this government intended to operate. He began issuing law. The Great Ming Code took most of his reign to reach final form and was built to be permanent. And it nearly was. The Qing dynasty later took it over with amendments, and its bones were still in Chinese legal practice into the 20th century. And he sent his soldiers out to do something armies almost never do. He sent them to farm. Millions of men were under arms at the end of the war. Demobilizing them into a wrecked countryside would have produced bandits. Feeding them out of tax revenue would have destroyed the revenue. So he settled the army on the land in hereditary military households, in garrisons that grew their own grain, on the theory that the empire could keep a standing army of 1 million men at almost no cost to the Treasury. It worked for about a century. Then it decayed, in ways that are going to matter enormously in the last third of this story. But in 1368, it was an answer to an impossible problem. And it was exactly the kind of answer this man produced. Practical, enormous, built to last forever, and completely dependent on the paperwork, staying honest. Because the thing he did first, before the walls and before the code, was start counting. In the year he took the throne, orders went out to the provinces to compile registers. Every household, every field, every mouth. He wanted to know what he had. In a county office somewhere in the lower Yangtze in the year 1381, a clerk opened a fresh register and started writing down households. Name of the head, everyone living under the roof, by name and age. Adult males, because adult males owed labor. The land the household worked, with boundaries, draft animals, and the category the household belonged to, civilian or military or artisan, because the category set what it owed, and the category was hereditary. He wrote it 4 times, 1 copy for the county, 1 for the prefecture, 1 for the province, and 1 to go to Nanjing. The Nanjing copy was bound in a yellow cover, and the whole system took its name from that cover. The yellow registers. In the next county over, a different man was doing something stranger. He was drawing. He was mapping every field in his district. Plot, B, plot. Sketching the shape of each one with its dimensions and its owner and its soil grade written inside the outline. When he finished a section, and the plots lay edge to edge on the page, overlapping in rows, the pattern looked like the scales on a fish. The Chinese called them the fish scale registers, and they are one of the most remarkable administrative objects the pre-modern world produced. Put the two together, and you have what Hongwu was building. The yellow registers told him who the people were. The fish scale registers told him where the land was. Cross-reference them, and the government of China could see, in principle, every farm and every family in the empire, and know exactly what each one owed. The scale of it is worth stating carefully. This covered a population in the tens of millions, across territory larger than Western Europe, and the registers were ordered, recompiled, every 10 years. Copies survive in Chinese archives today, with the ink still legible. Other states in that century kept tax rolls and land surveys. None of them was attempting to see a country this size, household by household, on a fixed cycle. A man who had owned nothing was building a state by knowing exactly what it owned. Now, the harder question: what do you do with the knowledge? Start with the emptiest problem, the North China Plain. There was land there, and nobody on it. Meanwhile, the Yangtze Delta and parts of the southeast were crowded, with more people than good land and families splitting holdings into strips too small to live on. So he moved them. The resettlement programs of the early Ming were among the largest deliberate population transfers anywhere before the modern era. Households were designated, sometimes by lot, and ordered north and west into the abandoned districts. The totals run to millions of people over several decades. It was not voluntary. Families were pulled off land. Their ancestors had worked and marched hundreds of miles to start over on ground, gone to weeds. There is a folk memory of it that has lasted 600 years, across a wide belt of northern China. Villages will tell you their ancestors came from under a great pagoda tree at Hongdong in Shanhai, where the migrants were gathered and processed and sent out. Enormous numbers of people today trace family origin stories to that tree. The tree is legend, or at least the specificity of it is. The migration underneath it is documented, and it was vast. And the fact that the story survived at all tells you what the experience felt like. What the government put on the other side of the deal was concrete, draft animals, seed, and tools on state credit, legal title to whatever you cleared, and the provision that made the whole scheme move: a tax exemption on newly reclaimed land. In some cases, for 3 years. In some cases, permanently. That last one is the quiet engine of the early Ming recovery. A peasant who broke new ground kept everything it produced. So peasants broke ground everywhere, and the reclaimed acreage in the official figures climbs through the rain at a rate that made later scholars suspicious until they went back through the county records and found it was substantially real. Then he told them what to plant. Every household with land was ordered to put in mulberry, hemp, yub, and persimmon in specified quantities. Scaled to the size of the holding, mulberry fed silkworms, which meant cloth, which meant a household could pay its tax in something other than grain. Hemp meant rope and coarse fabric. Jujube and persimmon meant fruit that dried and stored, food that would still be in the house in a bad winter. The orders went out again and again, and the tree counts in the reports run into the hundreds of millions. A man who had watched his family starve in a single month was legislating fruit trees into existence across a continent, because he knew exactly what a household with nothing in reserve looks like. Water came next. Local officials were ordered to survey and repair every irrigation work in their jurisdiction and report on it, and the totals from the first decades run to tens of thousands of ponds, dikes, canals and dams dug or restored. Granaries went up in every county, filled in good years against the bad ones, on a system that was old in China and had been allowed to rot under the late Yuan. And underneath all of it, he laid the structure that actually ran the countryside, and it cost the Treasury almost nothing. He grouped rural households into units of 110. 10 of those households were the wealthier ones, and they took turns, 1 per year across a 10-year cycle, serving as headman. The other 100 were organized in 10 groups of 10. The unit was called the Ligia, and its job was to collect its own taxes, organize its own labor service, keep its own registers current, settle its own petty disputes, and hand the results upward. Look at what that does. The imperial government does not need tax collectors in villages. It does not need police in villages. It needs a county magistrate, a handful of clerks, and a set of books. In the early Ming, a single magistrate might be the only appointed official responsible for a population of 200,000 people. And the thing functioned, because the village was collecting from itself and passing the total up. It let the Ming govern an enormous country with a remarkably thin layer of paid officials. It also depended entirely on the registers being true, and that took 200 years to become visible. He did one more thing here that nobody before or since attempted, and it says more about him than the tax code does. He wrote a book of legal proclamations called The Grand Pronouncements, packed with cases of official corruption and the punishments he had handed down. In language a farmer could follow. Then he ordered that every household in the empire own a copy. Owning it was a legal mitigation. Convicted of a crime with the book in your house, your sentence came down. Without it, your sentence went up. And inside it he put a provision that stands alone in imperial Chinese law. If a local official was extorting the people were authorized to seize him, tie him up, and haul him to the capital themselves, and anybody who tried to stop them on the road was subject to execution. There are recorded instances of villagers actually doing it, arriving in Nanjing with a bound magistrate, and being received, set beside what this man was doing to his own officials in the same decade. That provision looks less like idealism and more like a weapon. He was arming the countryside against the bureaucracy because he did not trust the bureaucracy. Now take the results, because they are the whole justification for the title of this story. By the end of his reign, cultivated acreage in the official figures had multiplied several times over from the wreckage of 1368. Registered population had recovered into the 60 millions. Granaries were full enough that the state was shipping relief grain between provinces as routine business. The canals were moving again. Counties that had stood empty had villages in them. The historian's caution belongs here. These are government numbers. And government numbers are always partly a story a government is telling itself. Land got hidden. Households got hidden. The registers overstated some things and understated others from the very beginning. But the direction is not in question, and neither is what it looked like from underneath. People who had been born into a country where the state had stopped functioning grew old in a country where the tax came at a known rate on a known date, where a flood brought relief grain, where the road to the next market town was safe enough to walk. Every farm, every household, every ox in the empire now existed twice, once in the world and once in a book in Nanjing. That was the achievement. The books were also the weakness, and nobody was going to find that out for another 250 years. In the first month of 1380, the Chancellor of the Ming Empire sent word to the palace that a spring of sweet water had appeared in the courtyard of his private residence. That was an omen of the highest order, the kind of thing that got written into dynastic histories, and the proper response was for the emperor to come and see it. Hu Weiyong invited him. Hongwu accepted and set out. He never arrived. Depending on which account you follow, a palace eunuch stopped the procession in the street and pointed toward the chancellor's compound, unable to get the words out. Or a guard reported armed men behind the walls. The emperor turned around, went back, and had the compound surrounded. Hu Weiyong was executed within days, along with his household, for plotting rebellion. The problem with that scene is that it is too well made. The miraculous spring, the mute servant pointing, the emperor turning his horse. It comes down to us in sources compiled well after the fact. In a political environment where the official version had to be that a chancellor conspired against a rightful emperor, historians have argued for a century over whether Hu Weiyong plotted anything at all. And there is a serious body of opinion that the plot was largely assembled after the arrest to justify what came next. What came next is not in dispute, and it is why the question matters. The Hu Weiyong case did not close in 1380. It stayed open for 14 years. Investigators kept turning up new names, associates of the Chancellor, men who had corresponded with him, men promoted by men he had promoted, officials, generals, clerks, their families, their in-laws, their household staff. The arrests came in waves through the whole decade, each wave reaching further out from the original circle, and every confession pulled out under interrogation produced more names, the way confessions under interrogation always do. Chinese sources put the eventual total at around 30,000 people executed in connection with the case. Modern historians handle round numbers in dynastic histories carefully, and the figure may be inflated. Even the conservative readings leave something in the many thousands. Over 14 years, out of one arrest. Then, in 1393, it happened again. Lan Yu was a general, one of the best the dynasty had. The commander who had ridden deep into the Mongolian steppe in 1388 and destroyed a northern Yuan army at Lake Buir, the most complete Ming victory over the Mongols in the entire founding period. He was arrogant. He was greedy. He had taken liberties with his rank and made enemies, and none of that is why he died. He was arrested for treason, executed, and the case then ran the same pattern outward through the officer corps. The figure attached to it in the sources is around 15,000. It removed most of the surviving senior military leadership of the founding generation. 2 cases, 13 years apart, tens of thousands of people, and between and around them, smaller purges running more or less continuously, so that a man serving in the Ming bureaucracy in the 1380s worked on the assumption that his career might end with his family being executed over something a colleague said under torture. What made it possible was an office created in 1382, and the office outlived its creator by 2.5 centuries. The embroidered uniform guard started as the imperial bodyguard and turned into something else. It had its own prison, operating outside the ordinary legal system entirely. It had authority to arrest, interrogate, and execute without reference to any court, any ministry, or any procedure. Its agents wore distinctive dress in public and plain clothes when they were working, and they reported to one man. There is a story about it that circulated in Nanjing and made its way into the collections. A senior scholar had a few friends over one evening, and they wrote poems, as scholars did. The next morning at court, the emperor described the evening back to him, who had been there, where each man sat. What was written, whether that particular evening happened, is unprovable. What matters is that officials in Nanjing believed it could have, and lived accordingly. There is a documented habit among Ming officials of the period of saying a proper goodbye to their families each morning before leaving for court, and celebrating in the evening when they came home. He also introduced something with no precedent at the top of Chinese government. He had officials beaten in public. Court flogging meant a minister was stripped of his outer robe in the courtyard in front of his colleagues and struck with a heavy staff, sometimes to death. What made it different from ordinary corporal punishment was the audience. The Confucian order rested on the dignity of the scholar official, on the idea that a minister was the emperor's partner in governing and was owed respect as a matter of cosmic arrangement. Hongwu took men who had spent 30 years earning that standing and had them held down in the dirt while their peers watched. Corruption he treated the same way, and harder. The threshold for capital punishment on embezzlement was set brutally low, and convicted officials were executed and then displayed in a manner the sources describe, and this story will leave at that. In the offices where they had served, the display was the instruction to whoever sat there next. And in 1380, in the weeks after Hu Weiyong's execution, he did the structural thing. He abolished the office of Chancellor, not the man, the position, and he wrote into the dynastic house rules that any future official who proposed restoring it should be put to death, along with anyone who supported the proposal. That office, under one name or another, had existed for roughly 1,500 years. It was the hinge of Chinese government, the senior minister who stood between the throne and the ministries and made the daily machine run. And it existed because no human being can personally supervise the administration of a continent. He took it out and put nothing in its place. The 6 ministries now reported directly to him. He was Chancellor, Emperor, Commander-in-Chief, and Court of Final Appeal, and he handled the volume by working like a man possessed. Surviving accounts have him processing many hundreds of documents in a day. He complained about it in writing, and he never delegated an inch of it. For him it was survivable. Barely. Because he was extraordinary, and because he wanted it. For his descendants, it was a trap, with the door already shut behind them. Now the other side of the ledger, because a man is not one thing. The same emperor running the embroidered uniform guard was the most aggressive anti-corruption ruler in Chinese imperial history, and the aggression was aimed downward at officials on behalf of farmers. He meant it about the peasants. Tax rates in the early Ming were genuinely light. Relief was genuinely distributed. A tenant farmer in 1390 lived better and safer than his grandfather had under the late Yuan, by a distance nobody argues about. He was a terror to the men who governed, and a relief to the men who were governed. And both of those were on purpose. Which brings this chapter to the thing sitting underneath the whole pattern. In the 8th month of 1382, Empress Ma died. She had been with him for 30 years, since the camp at Haoju, when he was a junior officer, and she was the commander's adopted daughter, handed over as a wife. She had argued with him the entire time. She interceded for men he had condemned, and got some of them released. When he wanted to execute the scholar Song Lian, who had tutored the heir, she refused to eat, and told him that an ordinary family that hires a teacher for its sons treats that teacher with respect for life, and Song Lian was spared and exiled instead of killed. She was the only person alive who told him no and survived it. He never named another empress. He mourned her in ways the court found excessive, and she was buried at the tomb he was building for himself outside Nanjing. Then, look at the calendar. The Hu Weiyong case was 2 years old when she died, and had another 12 to run. And the worst waves came after. The Lan Yu purge came 11 years after. The old man in the last decade of the reign was writing suspicious edicts, dismantling his own officer corps, and having ministers beaten in the courtyard, and the one voice that had ever slowed him down was not in the palace anymore. That is a correlation, and it should be stated as one. Nobody can prove she would have stopped him. What can be said is that she had stopped him before, repeatedly. And after 1382, nobody did. He had spent 30 years making certain nobody could take the empire away from his family. He was about to prove the danger was inside it. In the summer of 1398, riders left Nanjing carrying an order to the northern frontier. The old emperor was dead, and his sons, commanding armies along the Mongolian border. were forbidden to come to the funeral. Sons attended their father's funeral. In Chinese life, that was not a custom so much as a load-bearing beam of the universe. And the ritual obligations of an imperial funeral were laid out in detail, nobody improvised with. The order turning the princes back on the road told every man who heard it exactly what the new government thought of them, and it told them before the ground had settled over the grave. The new government belonged to a young man of 21 who had never held a command, and the reason it did goes back 6 years. Zhu Biao, the heir, the eldest son, trained for the throne since childhood, died in 1392 at 36. Hongwu was 64 and had just lost 30 years of succession planning to a single illness. And he had 20-odd surviving sons to pick from, several of them grown men with real armies and real experience. He picked the dead heir's son, a grandson, 15 at the time, raised by tutors, gentle by every account, deeply schooled in the classics, and possessed of no military experience whatsoever. The logic was primogeniture, and primogeniture was the law the old emperor had written into the house rules himself, and he followed his own law. The consequence was that 4 fully adult princes with battlefield records were now required to kneel to a nephew born after some of their campaigns. The 4th of those sons was in Beiping, the city we now call Beijing, and his name was Zhu Di. He was 38 when his father died. He had been posted to the northern frontier at 20, the most dangerous command in the empire, facing the northern Yuan across the steppe. He had led men into Mongolia and taken the surrender of a Mongol commander in the field. His household was military, down to the cooks. His officers had fought beside him for 15 years. And the frontier armies knew him personally in a way they did not know anybody in Nanjing. He was also, by the rules, his father wrote, barred from the throne for as long as the direct line existed. The young man who held it took the reign name Jianwen, establishing civility, and the name was the policy. He came in, surrounded by scholars, and the most influential of them was a Confucian named Fang Xiaoru, who will matter enormously in the next chapter. Their program was to soften the grandfather's system, reduce the punishments, raise up the civil officials the old man had terrorized, cut taxes in the wealthy southeast, and solve the problem of the uncles. The princes were a structural flaw, and everybody could see it. Hongwu had given his sons territories, personal guards, and command authority on the frontiers, on the theory that blood relatives would defend the dynasty better than generals would. Then he had spent his last decade killing the generals, which left the princes as the only serious armed power in the country outside the throne itself. Jianwen's advisers told him to disarm them, and to do it fast, and he agreed. What followed inside 12 months was a demolition. 5 princes went down in the first year. One after another they were accused, arrested, reduced to commoner status, and confined. The Prince of Zhou was denounced by his own son and exiled to the far south. The Prince of Qi was confined. The Prince of Dai was confined. The Prince of Min was stripped and sent away. Then they came for the Prince of Xiang. He got word the imperial officers were on the road. With the order, he put on his court robes, gathered his wife and his household inside the palace at Jingzhou, and set the building on fire with all of them in it. That was the spring of 1399, and every remaining prince in China now understood the terms. In Beiping, the Prince of Yan went mad. He was seen running through the streets of his own city shouting at nothing. He grabbed food and wine off market stalls and ate standing there. He talked to people who were not present. He slept in the horse stables, on the ground, among the animals, in the middle of summer, and when officials came to see him, they found him hunched over a burning brazier in the heat, saying he could not get warm. 2 imperial officials who came to inspect him reported back that the prince had lost his mind. A third, who spent longer in the city, sent a different report. He said the madness was theatre. While the theatre ran, the prince's household was doing other work. Weapons were being forged in a walled compound inside the princely palace, and the noise was covered by a flock of geese and ducks kept in the yard, which is a detail that sounds invented and turns up in the sources with too much specificity to throw out. In the 7th month of 1399, imperial officers arrived in Beiping with orders to arrest members of the prince's staff. He received them, and the men he had waiting killed them. And then he took the city, and then he issued a public statement explaining what he was doing. The statement is a small masterpiece, and it is why this war has the name it does. He was not rebelling. He said he was rescuing. His father's own house rules included a clause permitting a prince to raise troops and march on the capital if the emperor had fallen into the hands of wicked ministers. In order to remove those ministers and restore the dynasty to health, Fang Xiaoru and his colleagues were the wicked ministers. The nephew was a hostage of bad advisers. The uncle was coming to save him. The clause was real. It had been written for an entirely different situation, and the man invoking it commanded the best army in China, and nobody was confused about what was actually happening. But it mattered enormously, because every officer who joined him could tell himself he was obeying the founder rather than betraying him. He called it the Jingnan campaign, the campaign to pacify the troubles. And it took 3 years. It nearly failed. The imperial government had far more men, far more territory, and all the revenue. The Prince of Yan started with 1 city, and whatever frontier troops he could bring over. The fighting ran up and down the North China Plain from 1399 to 1402. And it was ugly. Cities changed hands over and over. The countryside between the Yellow River and Beiping was fought across so many times that recovery in those districts took decades. He won battles and could not convert them, because taking a city meant garrisoning it, and garrisoning it meant splitting an army he could not afford to split. He was winning tactically and losing on the map. And by late 1401, he was 3 years into a rebellion with nothing decisive to show for it. Then a eunuch came out of Nanjing with information, and the information was that the capital was empty. The imperial armies were all in the field, in the north, chasing him. Nanjing itself had almost nothing in it. So, in the first month of 1402, he stopped trying to hold territory. He took his army south, straight down the map, past fortified cities without besieging them, past garrisons without engaging them, cutting loose from his own supply lines and betting the entire war on speed. It was reckless enough to have finished him if it had run a week slow. The imperial forces turned and came after him, and were always behind. He reached the Yangtze in the 6th month, and the imperial river fleet, which could have stopped the crossing cold, changed sides. On the 13th of July, 1402, the army of the Prince of Yan came up to Nanjing, the largest walled city in the world, built by his father, with defences that could have held for a year. The gates were opened from the inside. Another prince of the imperial family, holding a section of the wall, gave them up. The rebels came into the capital, and as they came in, the palace began to burn. The fire in the inner palace burned for hours, and when it was out, soldiers carried 3 bodies out of the wreckage. They were burned past recognition. That is stated plainly in the sources, and everything in this chapter hangs off it. 3 corpses, damaged past any possibility of identifying a face, pulled out of a compound where the Emperor of China had been an hour earlier. Zhu Di looked at them and announced that one of them was his nephew. Then he wept in public, said he had come only to remove the wicked ministers and had arrived too late to save the emperor from himself, and ordered a state funeral with full imperial honors for the body he had just identified. More than 600 years later, this is still the most famous unsolved disappearance in Chinese history, and it is worth taking apart carefully, because the layers do not agree with each other. Start with what was said, the story that took hold, and has never stopped circulating, is that the Jianwen emperor did not die in that fire. In the fullest version, he had a way out. His grandfather, the story goes, left a sealed chest in the palace with instructions that it be opened in the gravest emergency, and inside were monastic robes, arazor, an ordination certificate, and a map of an escape tunnel. The emperor shaved his head, put on the robes, went out through the tunnel with a handful of attendants, and disappeared into the enormous Buddhist landscape of southern China, where a wandering monk was the most invisible thing a person could be. From there it branches. He lived out decades in temples in Yunnan, or Guizhou, or Fujian. He was recognized once in old age and brought quietly to the capital, where a servant who had known him as a boy confirmed who he was, and the emperor of the day let him die in peace. He left poems. He left inscriptions. Villages produce his relics, and in the branch that has outlasted all the others, the great treasure fleets that sailed for 3 decades under the next emperor were sent partly to look for him, in case he had gone overseas. Now the second layer, and this is where it gets interesting, because some of what supports the legend is not legend at all. Zhu Di conducted a search. Official records show that in 1407 he sent a man named Hu Ying out across the empire on a stated errand, the search for an immortal named Zhang Sanfeng, and Hu Ying spent something close to 16 years on the road, going province by province, temple by temple, reporting directly and privately to the throne. The cover story fooled nobody at the time and has fooled nobody since. Emperors do not fund 16-year expeditions for mythical hermits. There is an account, recorded later, of Hu Ying coming back near the end and being received in the middle of the night, after the emperor had already gone to bed, and talking with him alone until dawn, and nobody ever learning what was said. Then there is what Zhu Di did to the calendar. He abolished the Jianwen reign. Not the man. The years. The 4 years from 1399 to 1402 were officially redesignated as the 32nd through 35th years of Hongwu, which means his father's reign was extended on paper past his father's death so that his nephew's reign could be erased from the count. Documents using the Jianwen year names were to be destroyed. The veritable records of Hongwu's reign were recompiled twice under his direction, and the version that survives is the second one. And in it, the 4th son is a good deal more prominent than he was in the first. He also went after the men, and the case nobody has stopped telling is Fang Xiaoru. Fang was the leading Confucian scholar of the age and the chief architect of Jianwen's policies. Zhu Di needed him, because an accession document written in Fang Xiaoru's hand would have made the whole thing look legitimate to the scholarly class overnight. He had him brought in and ordered him to write it. Fang refused. He came into the hall in mourning clothes, wept, and when the brush was forced into his hand, he wrote a phrase denouncing the usurpation instead. He was executed in the most severe manner the law allowed. And the histories say Zhu Di went past what the law allowed. Chinese law provided for the extermination of 9 degrees of relatives in treason cases. In Fang Xiaoru's case, the sources describe a 10th category invented for the occasion, consisting of his students and their families, and give a total in the hundreds. That 10th degree needs a note. It appears in accounts compiled well after the fact, and modern historians have questioned whether it is literal or a later way of saying the killing went past every existing limit. What is not questioned is the substance. Fang Xiaoru died, refusing to write the document. His family died with him, and the purge of Jianwen loyalists ran to hundreds of executions and thousands of people enslaved or exiled. It is horrifying under the cautious reading as well as the dramatic one. So, which is it? Did the young emperor burn? Or did he walk? The evidence does not close, and the balance runs a particular way. The escape story has no contemporary documentation at all. Everything specific in it: the chest, the tunnel, the razor, the recognition in old age, comes from writings assembled decades and centuries afterward, in a genre that already had a taste for hidden emperors, and the physical circumstances of a burning palace under assault by an army are not favorable to a 25-year-old man with no military training slipping out unnoticed with a retinue. Against that sits the searching, and the searching is the one thing the official version cannot digest. A man who genuinely believed his nephew was in that coffin did not need Hu Ying on the road for 16 years. Which points where most historians end up. Zhu Di did not know. He had 3 burned bodies and no certainty. And he did what a usurper in that position has to do. He declared one of them the emperor, buried it with honors, and then spent the rest of his life quietly making sure. Now, the part that matters most. Why did the escape story survive, when the official version had the entire machinery of the state behind it? Because everybody could see the searching. An emperor who erases 4 years from the calendar, recompiles the histories twice, kills a scholar's students over a paragraph, and keeps an agent on the road for 16 years, is not behaving like a man with a body. The harder he worked to close the question, the more obvious it was that the question was open, and there was what the story handed people. Zhu Di could take the palace, the throne, the records, the reign name, and the historians. The one thing he could not take was the possibility that the rightful emperor was still out there, shaved and anonymous, standing in a temple courtyard in Yunnan while the man who took his throne got old in Beijing. It was the only punishment available. It cost nothing to believe, and so people believed it for 6 centuries. He had the throne, the capital, and the histories. What he never had was the body. The first piece of the Forbidden City was not laid in Beijing. It was cut down in a mountain forest in Sichuan, 1,500 miles away, by men who had reason to think they were not coming home. They were after Nanmu, a hardwood that grows straight and tall and resists rot and insects. And the trees worth taking were centuries old and stood in valleys with no roads. Crews went in on foot. They worked in country with tigers in it, and malaria, and the kind of ground where a fall ends a man. There was a saying that came out of the timber districts in those years, and Chinese sources still quote it. 1,000 go into the mountains, 500 come out. Once a tree was down, the problem became distance. The logs were dragged to the nearest watercourse and floated into the tributaries and into the Yangtze, down the Yangtze east, then north up the canal system, and the trip could take years. Some of the columns that went into the great halls had been standing in a Sichuan valley when the emperor who ordered them was still a provincial prince. That is where a palace comes from, not from architecture, from logistics, and from men. The bricks came from the south too, and they came stamped. Every brick carried marks identifying the prefecture, the kiln, the supervising official, and the individual brickmaker by name. His father had done the same thing at Nanjing, and the reasoning had not changed. A brick that failed could be traced to a man, and the man could be found, and the man knew it while he was making it. Tens of millions of them moved north on the Grand Canal, which was dredged and rebuilt over several years, specifically because the construction needed a working canal. The palace produced a national infrastructure project as a side effect of itself. The paving stones and the carved marble came from quarries closer in, and the largest of them created the problem people still talk about. Behind the Hall of Preserving Harmony, there is a carved marble ramp, a single slab covered in dragons and clouds, weighing in the neighborhood of 200 tons. It came from a quarry about 40 miles outside the city. No cart in the world could carry it, and no road could take the weight. So they waited for winter. Along the route, laborers dug wells at intervals of a few hundred feet. When the cold came down hard enough, they drew water and poured it across the roadway until it froze. And then they dragged the stone over the ice. Hundreds of men and mules on the ropes. In the dead of a North China January. It took most of a month. Modern engineers have run the numbers on the method and found it works, and that sliding a stone that size on ice took a fraction of the force any other technique would have needed. An empire that could organize that in the 15th century could organize almost anything. And that was the message. The labor totals are staggering and imprecise, which is normal for the period. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe hundreds of thousands of artisans and conscripted laborers on the project, with the figures for the wider Beijing construction program running higher still. Craftsmen were levied from all over the country and brought north for years at a stretch. The work ran from about 1406 to 1420, and it happened at the same time as the Grand Canal reconstruction. 5 military campaigns into Mongolia, a long occupation in Vietnam, and the largest fleet operation in the history of the world. The Ming state under this emperor was doing all of it at once. And this chapter is going to come back to what that cost. What went up was a rectangle of about 180 acres inside a moat and a wall, holding something on the order of 900 buildings, laid out on a north-south axis with a rigor that has no equal anywhere. The layout is the part worth understanding, and it takes 2 sentences. Everything on the central axis is the emperor. Everything else is arranged by how close it is allowed to get. You come in from the south and you cross a courtyard, and then another, and every gate you pass through is a filter that stops most of the people who came in with you. Foreign envoys reached a certain point. Officials of a given rank reached a certain point, Past a line in the middle of the compound, the outer world stopped entirely, and the inner court began. And the only adult males permitted beyond it were the emperor and the eunuchs. The buildings step up in size as you go north until the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and then the ground drops away into private residence. Nobody had to explain any of this to a visitor. He walked it, and by the time he arrived he had been told exactly where he stood. Then, in 1421, the emperor moved his capital there. That decision was bigger than the buildings. Nanjing was the founder's capital. In the south, near the wealth, near the rice, on a defensibly river, and it had every practical advantage. Beijing sat on the northern plain, less than 100 miles from the frontier, in a region that could not feed itself and had to be supplied by canal from 1,000 miles away. He moved anyway, and there were two reasons. The strategic one, he said out loud. The threat to China was Mongol. It came from the north, and a capital in the south was a capital that would always respond late. Putting the emperor at the frontier put the whole weight of the state where the danger was. Later, Chinese writers boiled it down to a phrase that stuck. The emperor guards the gate of the country. The other reason he did not say, Nanjing was where he had burned his nephew's palace, executed Fang Xiaoru, and taken a throne that was not his. Beijing was his own city, where he had commanded for 20 years, where the army was his and the officials were his appointments, and nobody remembered a Jianwen emperor at all. A man who took a throne by force needed, more than anybody alive, a throne that looked like it had always been there. He got about 3 months. The formal inauguration of the new capital came at the new year of 1421, with the whole court assembled in halls that still smelled of fresh timber. On a night in the 4th month, a thunderstorm came across the northern plain, and lightning struck the palace and the 3 great halls on the central axis, the ceremonial heart of the entire complex. Burned to the ground, 14 years of work and a forest of Sichuan Nanmu, gone in a night, in front of everybody. In the Chinese political vocabulary, this was not weather. Heaven had opinions and expressed them through disasters. And the correspondence between an unprecedented building project and an unprecedented fire was not subtle. Within days, memorials arrived at the throne, saying what the whole capital was already saying. The move north was wrong. The construction had exhausted the people. The fleets were a waste. Heaven had spoken. His first response was constitutionally correct. He issued an edict of self-reproach, blamed his own failings, and invited criticism. Then the officials gave him criticism, and he had one of them beaten, and one of the men who had argued hardest against the northern capital went to prison and died there. The 3 halls were not rebuilt for 19 years. Emperors held court in a lesser building, while the ceremonial center of the Chinese Empire stood as a burned foundation. And every envoy who came to Beijing in those years walked past it. The complex standing today is not, strictly speaking, his. It burned repeatedly over the centuries, fire being what happens to 900 wooden buildings across 600 years. And the halls there now are largely Qing reconstructions on the Ming footprint, following the Ming plan, on the Ming axis, inside the Ming walls. The plan is what survived, and the plan was his. Beijing is the capital of China today because a usurper needed to sleep somewhere else. In the autumn of 1415, a giraffe walked through the gate of the imperial palace at Nanjing, and the court had to decide what it was. It had come from Malindi, on the coast of what is now Kenya, by way of Bengal, aboard a Chinese fleet. Nobody at court had seen anything like it, and somebody made a suggestion that solved the problem beautifully. Chinese tradition described a legendary creature called the Qilin, which appeared only in the reign of a ruler of exceptional virtue. The Qilin had hooves, a long neck, a coat marked in patterns, and a gentle disposition. It did not step on living grass. The animal in the courtyard had all of that, and it had arrived under an emperor who badly needed heaven to say something approving about him. A court painter recorded it, and the scroll survives. The emperor accepted the gift and, with more grace than usual, declined the interpretation, saying his own virtue had nothing to do with it. He kept the giraffe. The man who brought it back was named Shanhai, and his life is one of the strangest ascents any state has ever produced. He was born around 1371 in Yunnan, in the far southwest, into a Muslim family. His father and grandfather had both made the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is where the family name Ma came from, a Chinese rendering of Muhammad. Yunnan was the last territory in China still held by Mongol loyalists, and in 1382 a Ming army came south and took it. His father was killed in the fighting. The boy was about 10 or 11. He was taken prisoner and castrated, as captured boys of that age routinely were in the period, and assigned as a servant to a member of the imperial family. The prince he was assigned to was Judi, in Beiping, on the northern frontier. He grew up in that household. He was tall and physically imposing by every description, and he served through the Jingnan campaign as a fighting man rather than a domestic, and he distinguished himself. When his master became emperor, he became one of the most trusted men in the empire, was given a new name, and then given a fleet. Between 1405 and 1433, 7 expeditions went out. The broad scale is not in dispute. Contemporary records describe fleets of well over 200 vessels and personnel of roughly 27,000 men. On the larger voyages, that is a floating population bigger than most European cities of the day, provisioned for years, moving as a unit across open ocean. They went to Champa and Java and Sumatra, to Malacca, to Ceylon, to Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. Later voyages pushed on to Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, to Aden, to Mogadishu and Malindi on the East African coast. Detachments went further than the main body, and at least one squadron reached the Arabian ports, and men from the fleet visited Mecca. None of this was discovery, and it is worth being plain about that. Every one of those routes had been sailed for centuries by Arab, Persian, Indian, Malay, and Chinese merchants. There were Chinese trading communities established in Southeast Asian ports before Zheng He ever left the Yangtze. The Indian Ocean in 1400 was one of the busiest commercial systems on Earth, and the fleets moved through a world that was fully mapped by the people who lived in it. What was new was that a state showed up. These were not merchant voyages. This was an imperial government arriving in force, with thousands of soldiers aboard, handing out silk and porcelain and imperial edicts, and collecting envoys and tribute goods to carry home. Rulers who accepted the relationship got trade, recognition, and gifts of enormous value. Rulers who did not got the other thing. At Palembang in Sumatra, on the first voyage, the fleet fought a Chinese pirate chief who had set himself up as a local power, destroyed his ships, took him alive, and brought him back to Nanjing. where he was executed, in Ceylon. On the third voyage, a conflict with a local king ended with Zheng He's troops fighting their way to the capital and carrying the king back to China as a prisoner, where he was eventually released and sent home with a replacement installed on his throne. In Sumatra, a rival claimant was captured and taken back. 27,000 men with weapons is a diplomatic argument. Everyone involved understood the sentence structure. Now the ships themselves, because this is where the popular version and the record come apart. The figure everyone repeats is 440 feet, roughly 130 meters, 9 masts, 5 times the size of anything Europe had. That number comes from written sources, and the earliest of them is not a ship's log or a shipyard record. It shows up in accounts compiled well after the voyages ended, including a popular novel about the expeditions, and the same dimensions get copied forward into the official dynastic history assembled centuries later. Historians have noted for a long time that the figures are suspiciously round and that the proportions they give, the ratio of length to beam, would produce a hull that behaves badly. The engineering objection is heavier than the documentary one. Wooden ships have a structural ceiling. Past a certain length, a wooden hull flexes in a seaway, works its joints, and leaks. And the largest wooden vessels ever built in Europe and America in the 19th century, with iron reinforcement and centuries of extra shipbuilding knowledge behind them, hit that wall well under 300 feet. Then there is the thing they dug up. At the Longjiang shipyard site in Nanjing, where the fleets were built, archaeologists excavated the timber slipways and recovered, among other material, a rudder post. It measured over 11 meters. A rudder that size is not decorative. It has to be proportionate to the hull it steers. And working backward from the post gives a ship far larger than anything else afloat in that century. So, the honest position is this. Naval historians disagree about the exact dimensions, and the defensible estimates run substantially shorter than 440 feet, and at the conservative end of that range, these were still the largest wooden ships anybody was building, in numbers, sailing in coordinated fleets of hundreds, provisioned for voyages of 2 years. The truth does not need the inflation. For scale, one line is enough. The first fleet left the Chinese coast in 1405. Columbus left Palos in 1492, with 3 ships and about 90 men. Zheng, he died at sea, or shortly after getting home, around 1433. At the end of the 7th voyage, he was in his early 60s. By tradition, he was buried at sea, and the tomb outside Nanjing that carries his name is understood to be a memorial rather than a grave. The 7th voyage was the last. No 8th fleet ever sailed, and the great ships were left to rot at their moorings. Why that happened has been explained badly for 400 years, and it deserves its own chapter. Sometime around 1477, a vice minister at the Ministry of War in Beijing went looking for a set of files and was told they could not be found. The story attached to that morning is one of the most repeated anecdotes in world history. The eunuch establishment had proposed a new expedition to the southern seas. The court asked for the records of the old ones, and a senior official named Liu Daxia, according to the account, had already pulled the archives of Zheng He's voyages out of the ministry and hidden or destroyed them. And, when the matter came up, he said that those expeditions had wasted tens of thousands of lives and mountains of treasure, and that even if the documents still existed, They should be got rid of. His superior is supposed to have risen from his seat and told him he had just earned a place among the great ministers of the dynasty. The story survives in a source written well over a century after the fact, and historians have gone around and around on whether the files were burned, hidden, or simply lost. The ordinary way 15th century paperwork got lost. But the anecdote has outlived every doubt about it, because it feels like the right shape for the ending everybody believes in. That ending goes like this. China had the biggest fleets on Earth, and then China turned its back on the ocean, sealed itself off, banned the sea, and settled into 3 centuries of self-satisfied isolation, while Europe went out and took the world. Here is the trouble with it. The men who cancelled the voyages were not thinking about the ocean at all. They were looking at a budget. Consider what the Yongle Emperor had been paying for at the same time. The Forbidden City and an entire new capital. The Grand Canal rebuilt end to end so that capital could eat. A war in Vietnam that turned into a 20-year occupation, and a guerrilla nightmare that swallowed men and money without producing anything. 5 personal campaigns into the Mongolian steppe, each one moving hundreds of thousands of men and animals across country with no forage, and fleets of 200 ships and 27,000 men going to Africa. No state on Earth in 1420 could carry all of that at once, and the Ming could not either. Officials said so at the time, repeatedly, in memorials that survive. The complaint was never that the ocean did not matter. The complaint was arithmetic. Then the emperor died, in the field, coming home from his 5th Mongolian campaign in 1424, and the arithmetic won. His son cancelled the voyages within weeks. That son reigned less than a year, and his son reversed the cancellation, and the 7th Fleet went out in 1431 and came back in 1433, and that was the end. The expeditions had been one man's project. When the man was gone, the constituency went with him. There was also a fight inside the palace, and it was never really about ships. The fleets were a eunuch enterprise. Zheng was a eunuch. His captains and administrators were largely eunuchs, and the whole apparatus ran out of the inner court instead of through the ministries. The scholar officials of the outer court, who staffed the bureaucracy and fought over the budget, saw it as the inner court spending state revenue on inner court glory. Liu Daxia, standing in that records office, was not casting a vote against the sea. He was casting a vote against the men who had run the voyages. And he knew that without the files there would be no expedition. And the danger had moved. The capital was now in Beijing, less than 100 miles from the frontier. A court waking up in Beijing had the steppe on the other side of the mountains, and the steppe could put cavalry outside the walls in days. Nothing in the Indian Ocean could threaten the Ming state. The Mongols could, and 16 years after the last treasure ship came home, they were going to prove it in a way that ended the discussion permanently. Now the part that takes the isolation story apart completely, and for that you have to leave the capital and go down to the coast. The maritime prohibitions were real. Private overseas trade by Chinese subjects was legally restricted for long stretches of the dynasty, and in some periods the penalties were severe. They were also, from beginning to end, close to unenforceable. The southeastern coast of China is a wall of harbours, inlets, and islands facing the richest trading system in the world, and Fujian and Guangdong had lived on the sea for centuries. When the state banned the trade did not stop. It went illegal, which meant it went armed. The 16th century produced enormous smuggling networks along that coast, run by Chinese merchants operating from offshore bases beyond the reach of any magistrate. The biggest of them belonged to a man named Wang Ji, a Anhui merchant who built a trading empire out of an island base and, at his height, moved silk and silver between China and Japan on a scale no legal merchant could match. He was not hiding in a cave. He was running a business the state had made criminal, and he had the ships and men to protect it. When the government moved against the networks, it got a war. Decades of coastal fighting that Chinese sources call the Woko raids, conventionally described as Japanese pirates, and in fact substantially Chinese, tore up the southeast through the middle of the century. Wang Ji was eventually lured ashore under a promise of amnesty and executed in 1559, and the raiding got worse afterward, not better. The Ming government had spent 2 generations fighting an insurgency it created by outlawing an economy it could not stop. Then, in 1567, it gave up. The court reopened licensed private trade through the port of Yugang in Fujian, and the legal Chinese merchant fleet went straight back out into Southeast Asia. Within a few years, the volume of Chinese commerce moving through Manila and the ports of the archipelago was enormous, and it kept climbing for the rest of the century. That fact should end the isolation argument by itself. In the century after the voyages stopped, Chinese trade with the outside world did not shrink. It grew spectacularly, to the point where a large share of the silver being mined on the far side of the planet ended up in China, paying for it. That story is coming in 3 chapters, and it is not the story of a closed country. What ended in 1433 was state-sponsored maritime expansion. The Chinese government got out of the shipping business. The Chinese did not. So why has the other version been so hard to kill? Because it answers a question Western readers have wanted answered for 200 years. And it answers it flatteringly. If China had the ships first, and the compass, and gunpowder, why did European fleets end up in Chinese harbors instead of the other way around? The turning inward story hands over a tidy moral. They had it, and they threw it away. We wanted it more. The actual sequence is duller and more human. A hugely expensive project, sponsored by one emperor, run by his personal servants, opposed by his finance officials from the start, got cancelled by his successors when the money ran out and the threat moved to the northern border. The Ming court did not decide the world was unimportant. It decided the danger was on land. 16 years after the last fleet came home, it found out how right it had been. On the 1st of September, 1449, on a dry plateau in northern Hebei called Tumu, a Chinese army sat down 2 miles short of running water and began to die of thirst. The nearest river was held by Mongol cavalry. Attempts to dig wells in the encampment came up dry. It was the end of summer on the northern plain. The men had been marching in circles for a month, and somewhere inside that column, in the imperial tent, was the Emperor of China. The size of that army has been argued over for centuries. Ming accounts give figures around 500,000. Modern historians treat pre-modern troop counts as inflation-prone, and the estimates vary a great deal. Whatever the true number, it was the main field army of the dynasty. And by the 2nd of September, most of it was gone. How the emperor got there is a story about a young man who wanted to be his great-grandfather. The Zhengtong emperor was 21. He had come to the throne at 8, which meant he had grown up entirely inside the palace, raised largely by eunuchs, and the eunuch who raised him was named Wang Zhen. Wang Zhen had been the boy's tutor and became the most powerful man in the empire. He ran the Directorate of Ceremonial, which by then handled the paperwork flowing to the throne. And after the last of the senior regents died in the 1440s, there was nobody left positioned to check him. Officials who crossed him were beaten, imprisoned, or destroyed. He was also, by every account, a man of enormous vanity who had spent years telling a young emperor about the founder's campaigns and about Yongle riding into Mongolia at the head of his armies. In the summer of 1449, the Oirat Mongol leader Essen came south in force. Essen had spent years consolidating the Mongol confederations and had a grievance about trade terms that the Ming court had handled with contempt. His raids hit the frontier garrisons hard. Wang Zhen told the emperor to lead the army out himself. Every senior official at court opposed it. The Minister of War opposed it. There was no plan, no logistical preparation, and no season left before the autumn rains. The army was thrown together in a matter of days, with supply arrangements that did not exist, and it marched north in the 7th month. It went wrong immediately. The column ran into weather and hunger inside a week, and men were reported dying along the roadside before contact with any enemy. Scouts brought the army past the field of an earlier defeat, where a frontier force had been destroyed and the bodies were still lying where they fell, and the sight went through the ranks the way you would expect. The commanders wanted to turn back. Wang Zhen agreed to turn back, and then the route became the disaster. The army started home by one road. Then it changed direction, and the reason given in the sources, repeated ever since, is that the new route passed near Wang Zhen's home district, and he wanted the Emperor of China to see his estate. Then it changed direction again, and the reason given is that he decided several 100,000 men would trample his crops. Whether those specific motives are true or were assigned to him afterward by writers who despised him, the maneuvering is documented. A vast, exhausted column doubled back on itself in open country with Mongol cavalry closing. They stopped at Tumu, on high dry ground, with the water in enemy hands. On the second day, Eisen offered talks. The Chinese camp began to shift toward the river, which broke the defensive formation, and the Oirat cavalry hit the column in the open. What followed was not a battle. The accounts describe a massacre. Ministers, generals, and the senior military leadership of the dynasty were killed in the field. Dozens of the highest officials in the empire dead in an afternoon. Wang Zhen died there too. By one persistent account, struck down by a Chinese officer who blamed him, and the Emperor of China was taken alive. He is said to have sat down on the ground when the fighting reached him and simply waited, and Mongol soldiers, finding a man in imperial dress sitting calmly in the middle of a rout, brought him to their commander instead of killing him. The news reached Beijing within days and produced something close to panic. The capital had no field army left. The best troops had gone north and were dead. The court had lost its emperor, its minister, and most of its senior command in one morning, and Essen was between the wreckage and the walls. At the emergency council, senior officials proposed evacuating to Nanjing. A man named Yu Qian stopped it. He was the Vice Minister of War, a career official with a reputation for incorruptibility and no faction behind him. And he said in the council chamber that anybody proposing to abandon the capital should be executed. The court held. He was handed the defense. Then he did the thing that decided the war. Essen had the emperor, and an emperor is only worth what you can trade him for. The Oirats brought him to the frontier passes and to the walls of Beijing and used him to demand that gates be opened, that ransom be paid, that terms be accepted. Yu Qian and the court enthroned the captured emperor's younger brother. At a stroke, the hostage was worth nothing. There was already an emperor in Beijing. The man outside was a former emperor, retroactively retired, and no gate was going to open for him. It was a brutal thing to do to a 21-year-old prisoner, and it was almost certainly correct. And Yu Qian, in the sources, shows no sign of agonizing over it. He then built a defense out of what was left. Reserve and garrison troops were called in from the provinces. Grain was rushed into the city. Weapons were manufactured at speed. When Essen arrived at Beijing in October, Yu Qian put his forces outside the gates rather than behind them, ordered the gates shut behind his own men, so there was no line of retreat, and fought at the walls for 5 days until the Oirats pulled back. Beijing held. The dynasty survived. A year later, Essen sent the captured emperor back. He was useless as a hostage, expensive to keep, and returning him was a way to make trouble inside the Ming court. It worked exactly as intended. The younger brother, now the Jingtai emperor and in possession of the throne, received his older brother with a ceremony that fooled nobody, and then confined him in the southern palace inside the imperial city. He stayed there 7 years. The accounts describe the gates locked and sealed. Food passed through an opening in the wall, and the trees around the compound cut down so nobody could pass messages or watch the place. Then, in 1457, the reigning emperor fell seriously ill with no surviving heir, and a group of officials and generals with careers to make walked into the southern palace before dawn, took the former emperor out, carried him to the main hall, and put him back on the throne while the court was assembling for the morning audience. It is called the Seizing the Gate incident, and it was finished before most of the government knew it had started. And within days of his restoration, the emperor who owed his capital to Yu Qian had Yu Qian executed. The charge was fabricated, and everybody knew it. The men who staged the coup needed the architect of the previous reign dead, and the emperor signed. The record has him hesitating, saying that Yu Qian had after all rendered service, and signing anyway. When Yu Qian's house was confiscated, the officials found almost nothing in it, and that is the detail Beijing remembered. His tomb sits by the West Lake in Hangzhou, and he is one of the small number of officials in Chinese history who is genuinely revered rather than merely respected. Now the wall, because this is where it comes from. The Ming did not build the Great Wall. Wall building on the northern frontier goes back more than 1,000 years before them, in earth and rubble, in fragments, under many dynasties. What the Ming built is the wall in the photographs. For the first 80 years of the dynasty, the strategy had been offensive. Hongwu sent armies onto the steppe. Yongle personally led 5 campaigns into it. The frontier was a place you attacked from. Tumu broke that thinking, and it accelerated a shift that ran the rest of the dynasty. The Ming never recovered the appetite or, in time, the capability for steppe campaigning, and the defense of the north became a matter of holding a line. Over the following century and a half, and especially through the 1500s, the dynasty poured resources into a continuous, fortified frontier of dressed stone and fired brick, with watchtowers in sight of each other, garrison forts, signal systems, and roadways along the top wide enough to move troops. That is the structure at Badaling that millions of people photograph every year. 16th century Ming brick, laid by a dynasty that had learned it could lose an emperor in a dust cloud in an afternoon. The most photographed structure on earth is a monument to fear. The cell was about 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep, dirt floor, with 2 ledges built into the side walls. Lay the boards across the lower ledge, and you had a bench. Lay them across the upper one, and you had a desk. Take them down at night. Put them side by side, and you had a bed. If you were short, a candidate brought his own brushes, his own ink, his own inkstone, and his own food. He was searched at the gate. Then he went into his cell, and the compound was locked and sealed from the outside, and it stayed sealed. The provincial examination ran 3 sessions of roughly 3 days each. He slept there. He cooked there, over a small brazier, in a space he could touch both walls of. When it rained, and it often rained, water came into the cell and onto the paper, and a smeared answer was a failed answer. If a candidate died in his cell, and men did die in them, the compound was not opened. The body went out over the wall. There were thousands of those cells at a major examination site. At Nanjing, the field ran past 20,000. This was the front door to the Chinese government, and for most of the men sitting in it, there was no other door. The system ran in 3 stages. The local examination made you a licentiate, which brought social standing, exemption from labor service, and the right to wear a scholar's gown, and stopped there. It was not an office. The provincial examination, held every 3 years, produced the men eligible for real appointment. Then the metropolitan examination in the capital, followed by a palace examination presided over by the emperor himself, produced the jinshi, the presented scholars, and out of that pool came the governors, the ministers, the grand secretaries, and most of the men left in this story. The numbers are what stop people. In a typical Ming cycle, the entire empire produced a few hundred jinshi, a few hundred, out of a population in the tens of millions. Success rates at the provincial level ran in the low single digits, so the compounds filled every 3 years, with men in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, men sitting the same examination for the 8th time. There are records of candidates in their 70s and 80s being granted honorary degrees for persistence, which tells you those men existed in large enough numbers to require a policy. The material was the Confucian canon, and by the middle of the dynasty, the required essay had hardened into the form known as the 8-legged essay. 8 prescribed sections, paired arguments, parallel construction, fixed length, and a fixed way of approaching the passage the examiners set. Originality of interpretation was not the point and could be a liability. Precision inside the form was the point, and that was the system working, not failing. An empire selecting a few hundred officials out of tens of thousands of candidates needs a standard that graders in different provinces can apply the same way. The 8-legged essay made an examination scorable at scale. It also produced, over generations, an administrative class that shared one body of reference, wrote in one register, and had spent 20 years learning to work brilliantly inside a fixed structure rather than around it. Whether that is a compliment depends on which century you ask in. What the system genuinely did was open the door. Ming records of successful candidates include large numbers of men from families with no official background, and a village that produced a jinshi was transformed by it. A poor family could pool everything behind one bright sun and, if he made it, climb out of the peasantry for good. That happened often enough to be believed in. And being believed in was most of its power. It gave millions of families a reason to invest in literacy and a reason to accept the order of things. Then there was the other staircase, and it went up the inside of the palace. The eunuch establishment of the Ming was enormous. By the later part of the dynasty, the estimates run to tens of thousands in imperial service, with its own hierarchy, its own schools, its own directorates, and its own security service. The founder had seen it coming. Hongwu, who had read enough history to know what eunuch power had done to earlier dynasties, restricted their numbers, barred them from handling documents, and by tradition had an iron plaque set up in the palace forbidding them to interfere in government. His son ignored it. Yongle came to power in a civil war in which eunuchs of his nephew's household had fed him information, and he trusted them the way usurpers trust the people who helped them. He gave them fleets, embassies, and armies. Then the machine drifted further, and the reason is structural rather than moral. Go back to what Hongwu abolished. There was no chancellor. Every document in the empire flowed to the emperor personally. The Grand Secretariat that developed in the 15th century was a working group of senior scholars who read incoming memorials and drafted suggested responses on slips of paper attached to each one. But the Grand Secretariat had no legal authority to decide anything. Its drafts were suggestions. Somebody still had to approve them in vermilion ink. And more often, the vermilion brush was held by a eunuch of the Directorate of Ceremonial, acting for the emperor. That is the whole architecture of the late Ming in one sentence. The scholar officials drafted, the eunuchs approved. The emperor, in theory, refereed. When the emperor was engaged, the system had a referee. When he was not, the two halves of his government fought each other with nobody above them, and one of those halves ran the Eastern Depot, a eunuch intelligence service with its own informants and its own prison. Working alongside the embroidered uniform guard the founder had created, an emperor could be forgiven for preferring the eunuchs. And the logic is uncomfortable and sound. A scholar official had a lineage, an estate, a home county, a network of classmates from his examination year, and sons. He had somewhere to go and somebody to enrich. A eunuch had none of it. His entire existence was attached to the man on the throne. From the imperial chair, he was the only person in the building with no independent future. And then, once, the whole apparatus was seized by one man and made to work. Zhang Zhuzheng became senior Grand Secretary in 1572. When the new emperor was 9 years old, he got there because two people decided he should. He had been the boy's tutor, and the boy's mother, the Empress Dowager Li, backed him completely. She had come into the palace as a low-ranking servant girl, risen through the harem, and produced the heir. And she raised her son with a severity that court gossip enjoyed for decades. She made the child kneel for hours when he misbehaved. She told him that Zhang Zhusheng spoke with her authority. Between the dowager in the inner court and Zhang in the outer court, with the chief eunuch of the Directorate of Ceremonial brought into the arrangement, The drafting and the approving were now in the same hands. For 10 years he governed China as thoroughly as any chancellor ever had, in an office that legally did not exist. He audited the bureaucracy, introducing an evaluation system that tracked whether officials actually delivered what they reported and removed the ones who did not. He rebuilt the Yellow River Works. He backed the General Qi Jiguang on the northern frontier and let him do his job. And the frontier was quieter than it had been in a century. And he went after the registers. Zhang Zhuzheng ordered a national resurvey of land, all of it, for the first time in generations. Officials went out and measured what was actually being farmed, and they found what everyone had always known and nobody had been able to say. Enormous quantities of land had disappeared from the tax rolls into the hands of powerful families with the connections to keep it off the books, and the tax owed on it had been quietly pushed downward onto the peasants who were still listed. Then he changed how the tax was paid. Versions of the reform had been tried in individual provinces since the Jiajing years, and what Zhang did was drive it across the empire. The single whip consolidated the tangle of grain levies, local surcharges, and labor service obligations that had piled up for 2 centuries into one payment, assessed largely on land, collected on a simplified schedule, paid in silver. Hold on to that last word. It reorganizes this entire story in the next chapter, and it helps take the dynasty apart in the one after. For a decade, it worked. The treasury filled, surpluses accumulated. The government of the Ming Empire in the early 1580s was solvent, staffed, and running better than at any point since the founding generation. Zhang Zhuzheng died in 1582, at 57, worn out. Within 2 years, the emperor he had raised turned on his memory. Charges of corruption and arrogance were brought. His titles were stripped posthumously. His property was confiscated, and the officials sent to seize the family compound sealed it before entering, and people inside starved. His eldest son hanged himself. The reform program came apart over the following years, and the land survey was abandoned. Zhang Zhuzheng's real achievement was simpler than any of his policies. For 10 years he made the books true again. It was the last time anybody managed it. In the summer of 1573, 2 Chinese junks came into the harbor at Manila and tied up alongside a Spanish galleon. The Spanish had been in Manila 2 years. What came out of those holds, according to the manifest that went back to Mexico, ran to more than 700 bolts of silk and around 22,000 pieces of porcelain, plus cotton cloth, iron goods, and gunpowder. What went the other way was silver, ingots and quine, dug out of mountains in Peru and Mexico by laborers who would never see China, shipped across the Pacific in the annual galleon from Acapulco, and handed over in a harbor in the Philippines to merchants from Fujian. Those 2 junks opened the most consequential trade route of the early modern world, and it ran between 3 continents that had been out of contact with each other for the entire previous history of the species. The reason it existed comes down to a price difference. China had a currency problem going back 2 centuries. The Ming inherited the yuan's paper money, tried to run it themselves, and watched it inflate into worthlessness by the middle of the 1400s. Copper coin existed and was inadequate for large transactions. What the economy wanted was silver, and China does not have much silver in the ground. So silver in China was expensive. Through much of the 16th century, the exchange ratio between gold and silver in China ran around 6-1, while in Europe it ran closer to 12. Silver was worth roughly twice as much in Guangzhou as it was in Seville. Now put the single whip on top of that. More and more households across the empire now had to lay hands on silver to meet their obligations, which tied local taxation to a metal whose supply depended increasingly on long-distance trade. At the same moment, on the other side of the planet, the Spanish opened the mountain at Potosi in what is now Bolivia, one of the richest silver deposits ever found, and the mines at Zacatecas in Mexico, and brought in the mercury amalgamation process that made low-grade ore profitable. The New World started producing silver in volumes with no precedent, mined under the forced labor systems the Spanish imposed on indigenous populations, at a human cost that is its own history and should not be passed over in a clause. Europe did not have a use for all of it. Europe had nothing China wanted to buy at scale, and it had a metal worth double in Chinese ports. The circle closed in 1571. When Spain took Manila and the Pacific crossing opened, silver went from Potosi to Lima, up to Panama or Acapulco, west, across the Pacific to Manila, and from Manila into the holds of Chinese junks bound for Fujian. Chinese silk and porcelain came back the same way, crossed Mexico by mule, and went on to Seville. A good deal of it never left the Americas at all. Colonial elites in Lima and Mexico City wore Chinese silk and ate off Chinese porcelain. And shipwreck archaeology off the Pacific coast keeps turning it up. The volumes are debated by economic historians, and they are large under every estimate. A substantial share of all the silver mined in the Americas across 2 centuries ended up in China. Japan, which had its own silver boom in the same period, sent enormous quantities as well, through Macau and through the smuggling networks along the Fujian coast. For roughly 70 years, China absorbed the world's silver, and the world took Chinese goods. Now look at what that did inside China. Because this is where the country people picture when they think of the Ming actually comes from. The lower Yangtze turned into one of the most commercialized regions on Earth. Suzhou, Hangzhou, Nanjing and the towns around them became manufacturing centers where households worked cotton and silk for a market instead of for themselves. Farmers in the Delta stopped growing enough grain to feed their own families and planted cotton and mulberry instead, buying rice shipped in from the middle Yangtze. That is a fully monetized regional economy with inter-regional specialization in the 16th century. And the people doing that work were mostly women. Silk reeling, cotton spinning, and weaving were household work done at the loom by wives and daughters. And in the Delta, that work stopped being something a family did on the side. It became the income. Local gazetteers from the period described towns where the sound of looms ran through the night, and household budgets where the woman's cloth brought in more cash than the man's field. Merchants came through the villages buying raw silk and finished bolts by the cartload, and a woman's output was the thing standing between a Delta family and the tax collector. Nobody wrote their names down, but the silk that crossed the Pacific and ended up on the shoulders of Spanish colonial gentlemen in Lima was made, thread by thread, by women in Jiangnan who never saw a coin of American silver except as the money that paid their household tax. And at Jingdezhen, in Jiangxi, there was a city that did almost nothing but make porcelain. It had been producing for centuries, and it scaled up to something industrial. Hundreds of kilns, a workforce in the tens of thousands, a division of labor so fine that a single piece passed through dozens of hands. one man throwing, one trimming, one painting outlines, another filling them in, and nobody making a whole object. The blue and white everybody recognizes was itself a product of trade. The cobalt that fires blue under a glaze came originally from Persia, and the earliest great blue and white was made for Islamic markets in shapes and sizes Chinese households did not use. Jing Dezhen made what the customer ordered. When Portuguese and Dutch buyers arrived, the kilns turned out European shapes and European heraldry to order and ship them by the tens of thousands. You can date a Ming trade route by what the potters were painting. The wealth changed the texture of the country. Printing exploded, because commercial publishers found there was money in books for people who were not scholars. Novels reached a mass readership, and Journey to the West and Water Margin took their lasting forms in this period, in cheap editions, for readers who had learned characters and wanted a story. Merchants who would have been socially invisible 2 centuries earlier built the gardens in Suzhou that are on the World Heritage List today, and commissioned the spare hardwood furniture that collectors still call Ming and pay accordingly for. A dynasty founded by a man who begged for a grave now had a consumer class arguing about porcelain glazes, and the phrase went into English. Ming vase entered the language as shorthand for something priceless and fragile, and it got there because those objects physically arrived in Europe and America in enormous numbers, and they are in American museums today, and the silver that paid for them came out of the Andes. One more thing about the arrangement, and it belongs here rather than at the start of the next chapter. An empire had made its taxes payable in a metal it did not produce. The silver came in by sea, from mines on the far side of the world, through ports the Ming government did not control, carried by a Spanish shipping system answering to a Spanish crown. In a chain of events, no official in Beijing could see, influence, or predict. For 70 years, the metal kept coming, and nobody in China had any reason to think about what happens if it stops. In the 5th month of 1592, the King of Korea rode north out of his own capital, with his court strung out behind him, heading for the Yalu River and the Chinese border, because there was nowhere else on the peninsula left to go. Japanese troops had landed at Busan 20 days earlier. Seoul had already fallen. Within 2 more months, they held Pyongyang, and the king was standing at the edge of his kingdom, writing letters to Beijing. The man who put him there was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had spent a lifetime pulling Japan back together after a century of civil war, and now had 200,000 veteran soldiers with nothing left to fight. He had been blunt about the objective in his correspondence. Korea was the road. The destination was China, and he wrote about installing the Japanese emperor in Beijing. The Ming court argued for weeks and then went in, and the reasoning was cold and correct. A Japanese army on the Yalu was a Japanese army 400 miles from the imperial capital, and Korea was the buffer the dynasty had maintained for 2 centuries. Better to fight in Pyongyang than in Liaodong. The war ran, with a long armistice in the middle, for 6 years. The first Ming force sent north was small and was destroyed outside Pyongyang, which taught the court what it was dealing with. The second was serious. Roughly 40,000 men crossed in early 1593 under Li Rusong with siege artillery, and they took Pyongyang back in a winter assault, then pushed south and were mauled at Bayok-Jegwan when they ran into massed Japanese infantry in bad ground. That set the shape of the whole war. The Japanese had the better infantry, And specifically, they had the arquebus in numbers. Tens of thousands of matchlock muskets in the hands of men who had been shooting at each other for decades. The Ming had heavier artillery, more cavalry, and a state behind them that could keep sending armies. And at sea, Korea had Admiral Yi Sun-sin, who took a small fleet against a much larger one for 3 years and did not lose, and cut the Japanese supply line along the coast until an army that had run the length of the peninsula in 3 weeks was sitting in fortified camps, eating its horses. Negotiations dragged on for years and collapsed, partly because the interpreters on both sides had been telling their masters what they wanted to hear. The Japanese invaded again in 1597. The Ming sent a larger force. Hideyoshi died in 1598. The Japanese command evacuated, and the last naval battle in the Straits killed Yi Sun-sin in the moment of victory. The Ming had won. They had held the buffer, restored an ally, and stopped an invasion of China at somebody else's border. The bill came to roughly 10 million taels of silver. Set that against a dynasty whose entire annual central government revenue in silver ran to a fraction of that figure, and you can see what happened to Zhang Zhuzheng's surplus. It went to Korea, and it did not come back. And Korea was one of 3. The same decade produced what Chinese sources call the 3 great campaigns of the Wanli reign. Before Korea, there was the Ningxia Mutiny in 1592, a rebellion by a Mongol officer and his garrison in the northwest that took a full army and a siege to put down. After Korea came the Boju campaign, an enormous operation in the mountains of the southwest against a hereditary chieftain in revolt, in terrain where every mile cost money. 3 wars in 8 years, all won, all huge, and together they consumed the reserves of the only period in the late Ming when there were reserves. Now the emperor, and this needs care, because the easy version of the late Ming blames one man for 3 centuries of collapse, and that version is worthless. The Wanli emperor came to the throne at 9 and reigned 48 years, longer than any Ming emperor. His first decade was Zhang Zhuzheng's decade. When Zhang died and the emperor turned on his memory and pulled the reforms apart, Wanli was a young man in his 20s taking hold of his own government, and for a while he ran it. Then came the fight over the succession, and it lasted 15 years. He wanted his 3rd son, the child of his favorite consort, named heir. The officials insisted on the eldest son, because primogeniture was the founder's own law, and because the entire Confucian bureaucracy understood the succession as the one place where the throne could not be allowed to indulge itself. They memorialized. They protested. They resigned in groups. He beat them, demoted them, exiled them, and they kept coming, because a scholar official punished for defending the rights walked away with exactly the reputation he wanted. He lost. In 1601, the eldest son was named heir, and then the Emperor of China stopped. For roughly the last 25 years of the reign, he refused to hold court audiences. He stopped meeting his ministers, most of whom served for years and never saw his face. Memorials went into the palace and did not come back out. Vacancies opened at the top of the government and were not filled, and they piled up until, by the 1610s, a significant share of the senior posts in the 6 ministries and the provincial administration stood empty, in some cases for years, with nobody appointed and nobody able to appoint. He was not idle. He read documents, and when something engaged him, he acted, and he ran the wars. What he withdrew from was the ordinary daily, mind-numbing work of approving the thousands of routine decisions the government could not make without him. Now go back 230 years to Hongwu. He abolished the chancellorship and wrote a death sentence into the house rules for anyone who proposed restoring it. Every ministry reported to the throne. The Grand Secretariat could draft and could not decide. The whole thing was built on the assumption of an emperor who worked the way Hongwu worked. Hundreds of documents a day, every day, for 30 years. The founder had designed a machine with no clutch. It ran only when the emperor's hand was on it, and there was no legal way to take a hand that was not there and put somebody else's in its place. So the eunuchs of the Directorate of Ceremonial filled the gap, because they were nearest the vermilion brush, and the officials of the outer court fought them for the ground, and the officials also fought each other, the Donglin partisans, a reformist faction organized around a private academy, spent decades in a running war with their opponents over appointments and ethics and eventually survival. In the 1620s that war produced the eunuch Wei Zhongxian, who ran the empire for several years, packed the government with clients, had shrines built to himself in the provinces, and had leading Donglin men tortured to death in prison, which brings in the boy who ended him. In the 9th month of 1627, the reigning emperor died young and childless, and his 16-year-old half-brother came to the throne with a reign name that meant lofty auspiciousness, Chong Zhen. The court expected nothing from him. Within 3 months, he had taken Wei Zhongxian apart. He moved carefully at first, accepting the eunuchs' resignations one at a time, letting the impeachments accumulate, and then he struck. Wei Zhongxian was stripped of everything and sent into exile, and on the road he learned what was coming behind him and hanged himself in a country inn. His network was dismantled. The Donglin dead were rehabilitated. The shrines came down. A 16-year-old had removed the most powerful man in China in under 100 days. And for one season, the empire allowed itself to think it had gotten lucky. 400 miles northeast of Beijing, a man had already been assembling something for 30 years. Nurhaci was a Jurchen chieftain in Liaodong, a Ming subject who had begun inside the Ming frontier system, holding Ming titles and trading through Ming markets. His grandfather and father were killed in the crossfire of a Ming punitive expedition in 1583, an incident the Chinese authorities acknowledged and compensated him for. He spent the next 3 decades uniting the Jurchen tribes by alliance, marriage, and war, and he built something the frontier had not seen in that form. The 8 banners organized the entire population into military and administrative units under hereditary command, so that every household belonged to a banner, and every banner produced soldiers. It was an army that was also a state. In 1616, he declared his own dynasty. In 1618, he issued a public statement of grievances against the Ming, the 7 Great Vexations, which functioned as a declaration of war, and took the frontier town of Fushun. Beijing assembled a punitive expedition, and in the spring of 1619 it marched into Liaodong in 4 separate columns to converge on Nurhaci's base from 4 directions. He destroyed them one at a time. At Sahu, over 5 days, the 8 banners hit each column separately before it could link up with the others, using interior lines and speed, and the Ming lost tens of thousands of men and most of its northeastern field army. Sahu is the hinge. After it, the Ming were permanently on the defensive in Liaodong. and the northeastern frontier turned into a war that never ended and never stopped costing. To pay for it, the government imposed a special surcharge on the land tax across the empire, the Liao levy. Then it raised it. Later, it added more, for training troops and for suppressing rebels. And every one of them landed on the same peasant households in the same registers. And the registers, by then, had not been honestly revised in over 30 years. In one generation, the Ming had won a great war, lost a border, and stopped being governed. In a county office in Shanxi in 1640, a clerk worked out the tax assessment for his district from the household registers on the shelf. The registers said the district held a certain number of households, working a certain amount of land, owing a certain quantity of silver. Outside, a good number of those households were gone. Some had died. Some had walked away. Some of the land in the book had been bought up years back by a family with a degree holder in it, and degree holders had exemptions, and the land had gone quietly off the tax rolls without ever leaving the page. The clerk assessed the district according to the book anyway, because the book was what he had and what he would be held to. The total owed did not shrink when the households vanished. It stayed, and it was divided among the people still standing there, who were now paying their own share and the shares of the dead and the departed and the exempt. 300 years earlier, in a county office in Anhui, another clerk had done the same arithmetic to a family named Zhu, and the boy who survived it went on to build the registers that were now killing this district. The Ming did not die of a cruel policy. It died of arithmetic that nobody updated. Go back to what the founder built, the yellow registers, recompiled every 10 years, the fish scale registers, mapping every field, a state that could see every household and every acre in China. The recompilation happened, on paper, for 2.5 centuries. In practice, county after county, clerks copied the previous edition forward with cosmetic changes, because doing a real survey meant walking up to the powerful families in the district and asking about the land they had absorbed. And no county clerk on earth was going to do that. Zhang Zhuzheng had forced a genuine national resurvey in the 1580s, and it was abandoned within a few years of his death and never repeated. By the 1630s, across much of China, the state was taxing a country that no longer existed. It was collecting from a population map drawn in a different century, adding war surcharges on top of it, and the gap between the map and the ground was being absorbed by whoever was too poor to have gotten off the map. The state that had been built by counting had gone blind. Now put the weather on top of it. The 17th century fell inside one of the coldest phases of the Little Ice Age, and it shows up everywhere. Frozen canals in Dutch paintings, failed harvests across Europe, and, in China, tree ring and documentary records showing sharp cooling through the 1590s, and again, harder, in the 1630s and 40s. For a farming empire, a degree of average cooling is not an abstraction. It shortens the growing season at both ends. It pushes the northern limit of reliable wheat and millet cultivation south. It turns a marginal harvest into a failed one. And northern China was full of marginal land that had been brought under the plough during 2 centuries of population growth. The cold came with drought, and the drought settled over the northwest. Shaanxi and Shanxi went into a run of failed years in the late 1620s and never really came out. The county gazetteers from those provinces are hard reading. They record people eating tree bark, and a white clay found in the hills that filled the stomach and killed within days. They record grain prices multiplying past any wage. They record the sale of children, and then they record worse, in the flat administrative language of men, writing it down as a matter of duty. Locusts followed the drought, the way they always did. Then, between 1641 and 1643, epidemic disease swept northern China. The sources describe outbreaks that emptied whole districts, moving through Shanxi and Hebei and into Beijing itself, where by some accounts, a fifth or more of the population died in the outbreak that hit the capital in 1643. What exactly it was remains debated. What it did to the defense of northern China in the year before the end is not debated at all. The garrisons that were supposed to hold the capital region had been thinned by disease before any rebel army came near them. And in the middle of it, the silver moved. Here the caution matters, because this argument has been overstated for decades. In the late 1630s, the flow of American and Japanese silver into China was disrupted. The Spanish tightened controls at Manila. Japan restricted foreign trade under the Tokugawa, and shipping losses and European wars interfered with the Trans-Pacific system. Some economic historians have argued this triggered a monetary crisis in China. Others have looked at the trade figures and argued the interruption was smaller and shorter than the theory needs. What can be said carefully is that disruptions in the silver flow were one component of a broader fiscal crisis rather than a single cause of it. Silver got scarcer and dearer inside China at exactly the moment when taxes were assessed in silver and the surcharges were multiplying, which meant a peasant had to sell more grain to get the same amount of metal. In years when he had less grain to sell, stack all of it and look at what a household in Shanxi in 1640 was facing at once. The harvest had failed, and had failed before. The tax bill arrived, assessed on a register that counted his dead neighbors. It was payable in silver, and silver had gotten harder to come by, and the amount had gone up 3 times in 20 years to pay for a war on the far side of the country against an enemy he had never seen. None of those alone brings down a dynasty. They did not arrive alone. In Beijing, the emperor knew. That is the part that makes the last years of Chongzhen hard to watch. He signed the surcharges himself, and he wrote about what they would do. His edicts from those years are full of self-reproach, blaming his own failings for the state of the empire, ordering relief he could not fund, and then approving the next levy because the army in Liaodong had not been paid in months and an unpaid army goes over to the other side. He was choosing between a rebellion in the northwest and a collapse in the northeast, and he kept choosing the northwest, and the northwest kept getting worse. He was working 18-hour days at this point, cutting palace expenses, wearing mended robes. It did not matter. A man cannot personally outwork a tax system that has been lying for 200 years. What the countryside produced instead was rebellion, and northern China had been producing it since the late 1620s, in bands that formed, got scattered by government troops, went into the mountains, and reformed. For 15 years, the Ming military played that game and kept almost winning. The man who ended it came out of the postal system. Li Zicheng was born in Shaanxi, in the district that took the worst of the drought, and by the traditional account, he worked as a courier on the government relay network, the system of stations and riders that carried official communications across the empire. In the 1620s, the court, hunting for savings, cut the relay system back and closed stations. He lost the job. in a province full of men who had lost everything. He was not the largest rebel leader at first, or the most successful, and he was nearly finished more than once. In 1638, a Ming army broke his force so badly that he escaped into the mountains with a reported handful of men. He came back because the conditions that made him kept making more of him, and because at some point he stopped behaving like a bandit and started behaving like a government. He took on advisors, including educated men, and they gave him what the earlier risings never had: a program and a slogan short enough to travel. He would take land from the great households and share it out. He would abolish the grain taxes. The rhyme that ran ahead of his army through northern China said it in a line: "Welcome the dashing king, and you will not pay grain." In a countryside where the tax was assessed on registers full of ghosts, that was the most persuasive sentence anybody had spoken in a generation. By 1641, he took Luoyang. By 1643, he held Xi'an. And in the first month of 1644, he declared a dynasty of his own and named it the Shun. Then he turned east, toward Beijing. In the first month of 1644, in Xi'an, Li Zicheng held a ceremony, took the title of king, named his dynasty the Shun, and issued a calendar. That last item is the one that counts. A calendar was a claim. In the Chinese order, the reigning house issued the calendar that regulated the farming year and the ritual year, and printing your own announced that heaven had moved the mandate to you. A bandit takes cities. A dynasty prints a calendar. Then he marched east toward Beijing with an army in the hundreds of thousands. And the remarkable thing about that march is how little fighting there was. Cities opened. Garrison commanders came out and submitted. Along the northern route through Shanhai, the fortified towns that were supposed to hold the approaches to the capital surrendered one after another. Sometimes, after a show of resistance, often not. Taiyuan fell in the second month. Datong went over. The frontier fortress line that had been built and rebuilt for 200 years to keep armies out of the capital region was taken from behind by men who had not been paid in months and had watched their own government tax their families to death. The Ming state in the spring of 1644 did not collapse under assault. It stopped agreeing to exist. The man sitting in the palace at the end of that road was 33 years old, and he had been trying to save the dynasty for 17 years. He had come in at 16 and destroyed Wei Zhongxian in under 100 days, and everything after that had run the other direction. Every account agrees on the effort. He rose before dawn and read memorials into the middle of the night. He cut palace expenses, sold palace goods, wore mended robes, and issued edicts of self-reproach in language no emperor was required to use. And he could not trust anybody for longer than about 11 months. In 17 years he went through more than 50 men in the Grand Secretariat. He appointed and dismissed ministers of war until the office became a death sentence. 14 of his provincial governors were executed. Frontier commanders learned that a defeat meant a summons to the capital, and that a summons meant the executioner. So they avoided battle, which produced more defeats. The case everybody remembers is Yuan Chonghuan. Yuan was the best frontier commander the late Ming produced. He had held Ningyuan against Nurhaci himself in 1626 with Portuguese cannon on the walls. One of the only clear Ming victories of the whole Liaodong War. And Nurhaci died months later of wounds that may have come from it. Chongzhen gave him command of the entire northeastern front. In 1629, Hong Taiji went around the fortified line, came through the passes to the west, and appeared outside Beijing. Yuan Chonghuan force marched his army back and fought him off under the walls of the capital. Then he was arrested. The charge was collusion with the enemy. By the account that has come down to us, the Manchus planted the idea themselves, letting captured eunuchs overhear a staged conversation and then allowing them to escape. Whether the trick happened exactly that way or was assembled later to explain an inexplicable decision, the court had its own reasons to want Yuan gone, and the emperor believed the charge. He was executed in public in 1630, by the method reserved for treason, and the crowd that had been told he let the enemy through came out to watch it. Beijing was still telling stories about that morning, a century later. Every frontier officer in China had now watched what happened to the one man who had beaten the Manchus. By the third month of 1644, the rebel army was in Shanhai and closing, and the court had two options and could take neither. The first was to move the capital south to Nanjing, which still had a complete duplicate government, walls, and the wealth of the Yangtze behind it. A move south offered a real chance of continuing the regime, as events after 1644 would demonstrate, but the founders' tombs were in the north, and the man who proposed abandoning the capital would carry the shame of it for 1,000 years. Officials would not propose it. The emperor would not order it without being asked. They stood in that hall and let the question die of etiquette. The second was money. There was no silver to pay the troops on the walls. Chongzhen appealed to his own officials and to his wife's family to contribute out of their private fortunes. And what came back was almost nothing. His father-in-law asked for a large sum, produced a fraction of it, and pleaded poverty. A few weeks later, when Li Zicheng held the city, his men put those same officials to the question with instruments designed for it and extracted a fortune from their households that historians have estimated in the millions of taels. The rebel army reached the outer walls on the 24th of April. The defense was a formality. The garrison on paper was large and in reality was a fraction of that, unpaid, thinned by the epidemic of the previous year, and manned in places by whoever could be pushed up the steps. On the night of the 24th, a eunuch commanding one of the gates opened it. Inside the palace, the emperor did the things a man in that position does. He sent his 3 sons out in disguise, hoping one of them would reach the south. He went to the empress and told her where things stood, and she took her own life. Then he went to the quarters of his consorts and his daughters, and what happened there is recorded in the histories in the plainest terms, and this account will leave it at what he said. His eldest daughter was 15. He told her she should not have been born into this house. She survived him, lived on into the following dynasty, and died a few years later. Then he changed out of imperial dress, went out through a rear gate of the palace with a single eunuch attendant named Wang Chengen, and walked up Coal Hill, the artificial mound behind the Forbidden City, raised centuries earlier out of the earth dug from the moat. Before he went up, he rang the bell. The bell in that courtyard summoned the ministers and generals of the empire to emergency audience, and the histories say it had never once failed to bring them. He rang it, and stood there, and nobody came. Some of them were already dead. Some were hiding. A number of them were drafting the memorials of surrender they would present to Li Zicheng within 48 hours. At the top of the hill, under a tree, the last emperor of the Ming took his own life. He was 33. Wang Chengen died beside him, and out of the entire imperial court that eunuch was the only person who followed his master up that hill. And then there is the note. What is said is that he wrote his final testament in his own blood on the lapel of his robe, and that it read that he had been unworthy, that his officials had deceived him, that the rebels could do what they liked with his body, and that they should not harm a single one of his people. What can be established is thinner. The versions differ. Some accounts put the text on his robe, others on paper. Others describe it as spoken. The wording changes from source to source, and the earliest surviving accounts were written in the weeks and months afterward by men who had not been on that hill, in a city that had changed hands twice. Every version shares the same two ideas. He took the blame, and he asked that the people be spared. Why did it survive? And survive in the bloodiest version? Because every party to what came next needed it. Li Zicheng needed a Ming emperor who had ended his own reign rather than one who had been hunted down. And he gave the body a coffin and a funeral within days. The Ming loyalists in the south needed a martyr, a hard-working emperor betrayed by his ministers, because that story left the dynasty's legitimacy intact and put the guilt on individuals. And the Manchus, when they arrived, needed him most of all, because their entire justification for entering China was that they had come to avenge the Chongzhen emperor and punish the rebels who killed him. 3 sets of enemies, all of whom benefited from the same story, and none of whom had any reason to check it. The dynasty began with a boy who had no ground to bury his parents in. It ended with an emperor who walked out of the largest palace on earth to find a tree. At the end of May 1644, a Ming general stood at the eastern end of the Great Wall with about 40,000 of the best remaining troops in China and a decision that had 2 exits and no good one. Shanhai Pass is where the wall runs down into the sea. It is the gate between the North China Plain and Manchuria, and Wu Sangui held it. Behind him, to the west, Beijing had fallen, and Li Zicheng was now emperor of a dynasty called the Shun, and the government Wu Sangui had served no longer existed. In front of him, to the east, sat the Qing state that Nurhaci had built and his son Hong Taiji had expanded, with the 8 banners, under the regent Dorgan. He had been ordered to Beijing in the last weeks to save the capital and had moved too slowly to arrive, which is a fact the Chinese have argued about for 400 years. Li Zicheng sent him terms. Submit. Keep the command. And the new government would confirm him. Wu Sangui, by most accounts, was moving toward accepting. Then word reached him about what was happening in Beijing to the families of officials, including his own father, and about a woman of his household named Chen Yuan, who had been taken by one of Li Zicheng's commanders. The romantic version, that the general changed sides over a concubine, has been a favorite in Chinese literature ever since. The plainer reading is that a man watching the new regime torture the capital's elite for money ran the numbers on what would happen to him once his army stopped being needed. He wrote to Dorgan instead, and the letter, as it survives, asked for help against the rebels in the name of avenging the Ming. Dorgan had been waiting outside that pass for a generation and had never gotten through it. He came, and he set his own terms on the way, and by the time the Qing army reached Shanhai Pass, Wu Sangui was not requesting assistance. He was submitting. Li Zicheng marched east to deal with him, and on the 27th of May, the two Chinese armies fought outside the pass through most of a day, and when Wu Sangui's men were close to breaking, the 8 banners came in on the flank in a dust storm and destroyed the Shun army. Li Zixing rode back to Beijing, held a hurried enthronement ceremony in the Forbidden City, burned part of the palace complex, and left the city going west. He had ruled from Beijing for 42 days. He was killed the following year in Hubei, in circumstances that remain unclear, possibly by villagers who had no idea who he was. The Qing entered Beijing in June, and Dorgan did 2 things immediately that decided the next 250 years. He held a public funeral for the Chongzhen emperor with full imperial rights, and announced that the Qing had come to punish the rebels who killed him and to avenge the Ming, and he moved into the Forbidden City without breaking anything. Consider that. A conquering army from beyond the wall took possession of the capital of China and did not sack it, did not burn the ceremonial center, did not build its own. The Manchus walked into the palace the Ming had built, sat in the halls on the Ming axis, kept the 6 ministries, kept the examination system, kept the legal code with amendments, and kept the officials who agreed to serve. They put the Ming administrative machine back into operation with their own men at the top of it. They were not replacing the Ming state. They were inheriting it. What that inheritance cost the population was enormous, and it belongs here rather than in a footnote. The Qing imposed the queue, ordering Chinese men to shave the front of the head and wear the Manchu braid on pain of death. And the slogan that went with it was blunt: keep your hair and lose your head, or keep your head and lose your hair. Resistance to that order in the Yangtze Delta, where the wealth and the scholars were, produced the killings at Yangzhou and Jiading in 1645 that Chinese sources describe in numbers running into the hundreds of thousands, and now the correction this whole story has been building toward, because the shorthand everybody uses is wrong in a way that matters. The Ming did not end in 1644. Beijing fell in 1644. The central government of the dynasty ended in 1644. What followed was nearly 2 decades of Ming resistance in the south under a series of imperial claimants that historians call the Southern Ming. And it was not a footnote. Regimes were established at Nanjing, at Fuzhou, at Zhaoqing. They fought. They lost ground. And they undercut each other, because there were multiple princes with competing claims and no agreement about which of them was the emperor. The last of them, the Yongli emperor, held out in the far southwest for years, retreated into Burma, was handed over by the Burmese king, and was executed in Yunnan in 1662 by Wu Sangui. The general who opened Shanhai Pass 18 years earlier finished the job personally, and off the coast, the war ran longer still. Zheng Chenggong, known in the West as Koxinger, the son of a Fujianese merchant and naval commander, held the southeastern seaboard for the Ming cause with a fleet, raided up the Yangtze, and in 1662 took Taiwan from the Dutch East India Company and made it his base. His family held the island in the name of the Ming until 1683. 39 years after the emperor walked up the hill, the capital had fallen. The last Ming resistance would go on for another 40 years. But the world the Ming had built had already changed hands.